Chapter 201. After dinner, John Landis originally wanted to have coffee with Eric and talk about some other things. However, when he saw the two girls sitting not far behind Eric, John Landis took the initiative to considerately leave. When he left, he even winked at Eric and made a cheering gesture, which made Eric not know whether to laugh or cry. He knew that John Landis must have misunderstood, but there was no way to explain this kind of thing. Otherwise, it would only make things worse. After John left, Eric called the waiter. After paying the bill, he turned to look at Julia and Elizabeth, who were not far away. If he wanted to leave, he would definitely have to pass by the two girls. The possibility of not being recognized was almost zero. Thinking back to Julia's drunken nonsense that night, Eric felt a little helpless. He was now a little confused about Julia's situation. Did the girl really have feelings for him, or was it because of some mental illness that caused her to submit to him? However, one thing was certain. The girl clearly wanted to get rid of this feeling. Eric did not lack women, although he would try his best to keep the women he liked by his side. However, Julia was not the type he particularly liked, so he did not want to get involved with the girl. The waiter brought the change and receipt. Eric paid the tip, stood up, and walked directly to Julia's table. Since I can't avoid her, I'll just greet her. As Eric walked closer, Elizabeth was the first to notice him. The girl was stunned, but she calmly picked up her coffee to hide the surprised expression on her face. As such, Julia didn't notice the change in Elizabeth's expression. She continued to chatter softly, looking very excited. Although Julia was 3 years older than him, the girl had always been a little reserved when she was around him. It was rare for her to talk so much. Therefore, Eric was very curious about what the girl was talking about. He made a shushing gesture to Elizabeth, and Eric quietly walked behind Julia. The producer told me, Julia, we will be shooting in the studio the whole time. Even if it's a real scene, I can use a stunt double and comfortably finish the film. Also, if you are not satisfied with the script, you can edit it yourself. I was very excited when I heard that. They personally came to a small town in the south and came to me with such sincerity. They even offered me a high price of $5 million USD. I felt that I had never been so valued before. So I asked them to send the script over, but when I saw the name of the female lead, I couldn't stand it. Can you imagine, Liz? They actually named the female lead Vivian. My God, it's too obvious that they are following the trend. I suggested that the producer change the name first, but he said that the plot can be changed, but the name can't be changed. He also told me a lot of benefits. I remembered some of the things he told me about following the trend, so listening to Julia's rapid speech, Eric, who was standing behind the girl, smiled faintly. Elizabeth, who was sitting opposite Julia, smiled and interrupted the girl's words. She asked the obvious, Julia, who is this you're talking about? Julia seemed to be a little thirsty. She took a few sips of juice and said, Oh, you know, although that guy is a bastard, many of the things he said are quite reasonable. Oh, Elizabeth raised her chin and glanced at Eric, who was standing behind the girl with his hands in his trouser pockets. So you've completely gotten rid of that guy's shadow? Of course. Julia waved her small hand without hesitation and raised her voice slightly. I've already pulled that bastard's shadow out of his head, crumpled it into a ball, and flushed it down the toilet. Pfft! Elizabeth couldn't hold it in anymore. She covered her mouth in panic and threw herself on the table. She shrugged her shoulders and giggled. The surrounding diners couldn't help but look over when they heard the commotion. Of course, some people looked at Eric, who was behind Julia. If Julia still didn't feel anything strange, she would be a little retarded. Eric clearly saw that the girl's back involuntarily straightened a little. She seemed to want to turn her head, but her neck seemed to be rusty and stuck there. Hearing you say that really makes me sad, Eric shrugged and joked. He walked forward and sat down in the empty seat between the two girls. When Julia heard Eric's voice, her expression began to change rapidly. When Eric sat down next to her, the girl's fantasy was completely shattered. Her big eyes stayed on Eric's face for a few seconds. Suddenly, she shrank her neck and bent her waist, as if she wanted to curl into the chair to hide herself. She explained hesitantly, Eric, I didn't mean that. When Eric saw the girl's awkward look, He smiled and was about to joke with Julia a few more times. The girl squeaked a few times and suddenly stood up. I'll leave first. After saying that, the girl fled the restaurant in a panic. Eric watched Julia's back disappear speechlessly. He thought to himself, am I really that scary? He patted Elizabeth, who was still lying on the table, and said, Hey Liz, stop laughing. Be careful of the muscles on your face cramping. Only then did Elizabeth raise her head. Her face was red, and her shallow dimples were still hanging on her cheeks. She glanced across and asked, Hey, where's Julia? Eric pursed his lips and said, Isn't it because of your prank that Julia left in a fit of anger? Elizabeth glared at Eric and said, How can you blame me? You were the one who told me not to make a sound. I was just curious. I wanted to hear what Julia was saying. You were the one who led her to the pit, right? Elizabeth turned her head and looked at the door. She couldn't find Julia's voice, so she could only say, Okay, I'll apologize to her later. But in the end, it's still your fault. I took her around half the world. It wasn't easy for Julia to forget about you, but you just had to appear at this time. There was really no way to reason with an unreasonable woman. Eric thought helplessly. He could only change the topic and said, Aren't you still in school? It's already September. School should start soon, right? I've already finished all the courses I need to study. The last year is to do my graduation thesis and social practice, Elizabeth said briefly. Elizabeth gave a simple introduction and said, I've said before that my graduation thesis is about the analysis of several of your movies. How about it, great director? Can you provide me with some internal information? Eric didn't agree. Instead, he asked, You should have gotten a lot of information from Julia these days, right? Elizabeth had a helpless expression. I'm really curious about what happened between the two of you. Julia is so infatuated with you that she's hopelessly infatuated. Although she wants to bite you to death, she only says nice things. It doesn't feel real at all. Maybe I've always been like this, Eric said with a smile. That's impossible. Elizabeth shook her head firmly. Eric was puzzled. Hey Liz, are you studying me or my movies? Both. Elizabeth didn't hide anything. I'm very interested in everything about you. I remember warning you. Before Eric could finish his sentence, Elizabeth was like a cat whose tail had been stepped on. She stared at Eric with her beautiful eyes and interrupted him. Busy. Okay. Eric spread his hands helplessly. I've said my goodbyes. If there's nothing else, I'm leaving. Remember to bring Julia back to Los Angeles as soon as possible. Kapoor was so angry with Julia that his hair turned white. Elizabeth rolled her eyes at Eric. Nonsense. Don't think I don't know that Julia's manager is bald and has white hair. I'm just making an analogy. Eric stood up nonchalantly. Just remember it. When the woman saw that Eric was about to leave, she immediately grabbed his collar. Hey, why are you in such a hurry? Since we've met, let's sit down and chat. Tell me about your movie. Eric looked at the woman grabbing his collar tightly without caring about her image. He had no choice but to sit down again and say, Liz, I'll teach you. Actually, what you need to do is reverse analysis of the known results. The method is very simple. You just have to praise it as much as you can. Just like the newspapers and media, list a lot of good points about the movie and exaggerate. I guarantee that you'll get an A in your thesis. After saying this, Eric remembered the antique appraisal programs he watched in his previous life. The experts didn't need to say the final results. They could tell whether an antique was real or fake just by listening to their words. It was very simple. If it was real, the experts would praise it as much as they could from the beginning. They would say that it was exquisite, the workmanship was exquisite, and so on. If it was fake, they would start to belittle it and pick on the flaws. Generally speaking, most of the time, they were just fooling laymen to watch the show. When Elizabeth heard Eric's perfunctory words, she rolled her eyes unhappily. Hey, am I such a superficial person? Eric raised his eyebrows and made a look that said, Isn't that so? The woman was so angry that she wanted to slam the table. I'm warning you. If you don't help, I'll kidnap Julia to a ranch in Australia. You won't be able to find her even if you want to shoot a movie. Hearing the woman's childish words, Eric couldn't help but laugh. Do whatever you want. As long as Julia is willing. Eric didn't want to argue with Elizabeth anymore. He stood up and walked out of the restaurant. The woman quickly waved her hand and called the waiter to pay the bill. She then chased after him. Chapter 202. After running out of the restaurant, Elizabeth found that Eric was nowhere to be seen. She could only return to her hotel in disappointment. Julia, what are you doing? When she returned to the hotel room, Elizabeth saw a suitcase lying in the middle of the bedroom. Julia was packing her clothes. Julia folded a small t-shirt and stuffed it into the suitcase. She raised her head and explained, I'm leaving. I think I should go back to Los Angeles. Elizabeth stomped her feet in disappointment. She reached out and pulled the flustered girl up and pressed her down on the chair. Look at you now. You're like a little beast that's in a hurry to escape after encountering a natural enemy. Julia's thoughts were exposed, and her eyes flashed a few times in a panic before she forced herself to focus and complained to Elizabeth. It's all your fault. You clearly saw him behind me, but you didn't warn me. After I said those words, that guy will definitely want to teach me a lesson. Elizabeth couldn't help but laugh. Haha, how will he teach you a lesson? Stop fooling around, Julia. Those are all your imagination, okay? Julia couldn't help but shrink her neck. You don't understand, Liz. That guy is very bad. Elizabeth really couldn't understand Julia's behavior. She couldn't help but facepalm for a while before pulling the girl up. Come follow me. Where are we going? Julia stood up with Elizabeth's help. We're going to find Eric Williams. Since you're worried, I'll help you clarify things in person and tell him not to harass you in the future. When the girl heard Elizabeth's words, she immediately slipped into the chair and refused to get up. Her small hands were still tightly gripping the armrest as she explained. He's never harassed me. Then tell me, what's wrong with you? I'm not too sure. Anyway, I'm just a little scared of him. Also, because of that drunkenness and today's incident, I don't dare to see him even more. Liz, don't worry about it, okay? Julia stammered. Although she and Elizabeth were already close friends, Julia didn't tell her the biggest secret in her heart. Currently, that secret was still only known to her and Eric. Moreover, she didn't know if her emotions were caused by Stockholm Syndrome. She had secretly read some related books, but the symptoms seemed different. Could it be a mutation? Elizabeth paced around the empty space in the bedroom in distress. Suddenly, she clapped her hands and said, Julia, don't you think so? The girl raised her head curiously. Elizabeth analyzed. Perhaps it's because you've had too little contact with him, and in the few short encounters you had with him, he appeared to be more dominant, so it created such an impression in your heart. Maybe. Julia nodded. She thought about it carefully, and that was more or less the case. Even when they were filming Pretty Woman, she didn't get to spend time alone with Eric more than a few times. In fact, from the moment they met until now, she had only been with him that one time. Although her impression of him was quite deep, it was only that one time. And then other impressions. The first night they met, he looked down at her and said that he could send her to the top of Hollywood. When they were filming Wind and Moon, she took the initiative to give him a hint. He said, forget it, I have to hurry back. She used AL's invitation to test him, and he said lightly, go, don't delay tomorrow's filming. In the trailer, he raised his hand, and she actually felt a sense of anticipation in her heart. Then he opened the car door with a crash. After Wind and Moon was a success, she went to look for him in a domineering manner. He scolded her. Why are you so impatient? What do you want to do? The company assigned a chauffeur and bodyguard to her. She found it very novel and ran to him to show off, and he mocked her with his eyes. It was as if, from the beginning of everything, she had been standing in the dust and looking up at him, and he had been like a high and mighty god, unreachable. At the same time, he had blocked the sun and shrouded her in his shadow. When Elizabeth saw the girl in deep thought, she couldn't help but snap her fingers twice in Julia's ear. Ah. The girl suddenly woke up and looked at Elizabeth in confusion. Julia, don't you want to change the situation? How do I change it? Elizabeth said. It's very simple. Spend more time with him. I think Eric Williams isn't as scary as you think. Coincidentally, he's in Venice, and he's not busy with the movie. You can spend more time with him and get to know him better. Maybe you won't be afraid of him anymore. With some faint expectations in her heart, Julia finally looked up. Is this really okay? How do you know if you don't try? Elizabeth saw that Julia was a little hesitant, so she quickly took the opportunity to pull the girl up. Let's go, we'll go find him now. Wait, I think I'd better change my clothes, Julia said as she struggled to get up. Elizabeth looked at Julia's loose pink sleeveless t-shirt and jeans, shook her head, and said, this is fine. Besides, it's already past 9 o'clock in the evening. You'll have to take it off later. Why bother? After that, Elizabeth dragged Julia out of the room. Eric had just taken a shower and changed into simple clothes. He turned on the TV and flipped through it a few times. Although the hotel had cable TV signals from several major North American television stations, there weren't any good programs. He couldn't understand the local TV stations, so he turned it off and picked up the Walden book that Drew bought for him before he boarded the plane. As a middle-aged man whose mental age was more than 40 years old, it was difficult for him to calm down due to the entanglement of worldly affairs. Eric couldn't bear to read this kind of prose anthology. He only flipped through it once on the plane, and in the end he was unknowingly hypnotized to sleep. Now that he was reading it again, he didn't find it interesting, and he began to feel sleepy. Just as he was about to sleep, the phone in the room rang. When he picked it up, he heard that it was a call from the hotel's front desk, saying that someone was looking for him. Come in. It's so late. What are you doing here? Eric asked casually as he invited the two girls into the room. Elizabeth didn't care about Julia, who was a little nervous behind her. She walked around the spacious living room a few times, picked up the book that Eric put on the coffee table, and looked up. Oh, I didn't expect you to like this book too. Eric poured 2 glasses of juice for the two girls. When he heard Elizabeth's question, he casually replied, I don't like it. Chapter 203. When Elizabeth heard Eric's answer, she glared at him and said, You are really ungentlemanly. What does this have to do with being gentlemanly? Eric opened a can of beer and sat down on the sofa. Am I supposed to go along with what you said? Say that I like this book, and then have a long talk with you about the philosophy of life conveyed in the book, and regret that we didn't meet sooner? Isn't that usually the case? Elizabeth raised her head and asked matter-of-factly. Eric smiled and said, You must have encountered this kind of thing a lot when you were in school, right? Elizabeth nodded honestly. Julia, who was holding her juice cautiously, couldn't help but chuckle. She had entered society after graduating from high school. Although she didn't have Elizabeth's high IQ and education, she was much more knowledgeable in interpersonal relationships than Elizabeth, who had been well protected since she was young. She understood certain things after thinking about it for a while. Eric also laughed. He looked at Elizabeth's puzzled gaze and explained, With your identity as the second daughter of the News Corporation, if a man wants to get close to you, he definitely can't do it physically. He can only do it on a spiritual level. So silly girl, most of the time, when you encounter this kind of thing, it's men who want to hit on you. This was the first time Elizabeth had been exposed. She thought about how she did feel attracted by this kind of thing before. She couldn't help but open her mouth slightly and look stunned. Eric took a sip of beer and leaned on the sofa with a sigh. He said, Speaking of which, I often used such a low-cost method to hit on girls in my previous life. Ah, bah. Although Elizabeth knew that Eric was probably telling the truth, she still spat at Eric and said, Do you think all men are as dirty as you? For most men, becoming the son-in-law of the Murdoch family can save them 30 years of hard work. So what if they're dirty? Elizabeth retorted. These are all your conjectures. You know whether they're conjectures or not. Eric had no intention of arguing with the girl. By the way, why are you looking for me so late at night? When Julia heard this question, she straightened her back slightly. She would always do this when she was nervous. Elizabeth said generously, Since you're in Venice, let's go have some fun together. How about tomorrow? Eric thought about the schedule and nodded. No problem. I happen to be free tomorrow. Elizabeth originally thought that it would take some persuasion to invite Eric, but she didn't expect him to agree so easily. It was already late at night in Venice, and it wasn't appropriate for the two women to stay in a man's room for too long. After chatting for a while, she got up and left with Julia, who hadn't said much since the beginning. The next day, Andrei Smirnov, the chairman of the jury, invited Eric to have breakfast with him early in the morning. Although they needed the help of a translator to communicate, the two of them still chatted happily. They chatted in the restaurant of the boutique hotel until 9 o'clock before Andrei Smirnov had to leave reluctantly because of work. Eric brought Ellen to the agreed dock and discovered that Julia and Elizabeth had been waiting for a long time. As soon as Eric appeared, Elizabeth complained unhappily, "Hey, Eric, you're really not punctual. How could you make the two girls wait for so long?" "I still have things to do. I'm not as free as you two young ladies," Eric explained and asked Ellen to rent a boat. They were going to the main island of Venice today. After finding a speedboat, Elizabeth pulled Julia into the cabin, but she drove away Ellen, who was acting as the translator, on the grounds that she also knew Italian. After taking the speedboat to the main island, the three of them changed to a gondola and wandered along the Grand Canal. The morning sun shone warmly on them. Eric, in casual clothes, leaned on the chair in the gondola and looked at the surrounding architectural mirrors with great interest. From time to time, he raised the camera in front of him to take a few photos. Elizabeth, sitting on the other side, chatted loudly in Italian with a ferryman in his 50s named Loviso, who was standing at the bow. The two of them laughed heartily from time to time. "Hey Julia, why aren't you talking? Are you not feeling well?" Eric pressed the shutter a few times at an arch bridge, only to find that the girl sitting next to him had been quiet. This gondola only had one seat, so the three of them were squeezed together. Eric was on the right, Elizabeth was on the left, and Julia was in the middle. The two girls were slim, and Eric was not fat, so the seats were not too crowded with three people. Julia raised her head and saw Eric's concerned eyes. She quickly said, "No. Oh." Eric thought for a moment and did not know what to say. Just as he was about to raise the camera to take more photos, the girl spoke first. Her voice was a little low. "Eric, when are you going back to Los Angeles?" "September 5th, the day after tomorrow." The girl raised her head and looked at Eric. She curiously asked, "Why are you in such a hurry? Aren't you going to stay in Venice for a few more days?" Eric raised the camera and captured the silhouette of a seabird flying across the water. He casually explained, "I want to rest for a while, but I have to shoot 2 movies in the next 2 months. Time is tight." The young woman nodded and gently lowered her head. "By the way, Julia, when do you plan to go back?" Julia hesitated for a moment before saying, "Originally, Liz said she wanted to take me to Australia. Her family has a lot of ranches there, but I don't plan to go. It's time to go back." Steel Magnolias is scheduled to be released in November. It's about time you cooperate with the promotion. Also, you need to choose the script for next year's movie. Julia looked at Eric with a complicated gaze. After a moment, she said, "You?" Eric lowered his head and took out the finished film from the camera and put it away. He changed to a new roll of film and looked up at Julia's expression. He quickly understood what the girl was thinking and said with a smile, "I won't interfere with your movie next year. You can try to choose for yourself. Of course, it's best if you listen to Kapoor's opinion." This year he had selected 2 blockbuster movies for the girl. This had already sent Julia to the peak in a short period of time. Although Eric could let the girl maintain this peak, Eric felt that it was better to let the girl experience some ups and downs based on Julia's personality. Moreover, he wouldn't work as hard as he did this year to make movies next year. If he continued to make movies crazily and every movie was a blockbuster, the moguls who had split too many benefits couldn't take it anymore. It wasn't impossible for them to hire someone to kill him. He planned to focus on a plan that was crucial to his future movie career next year. When Eric was rudely interfering with her movie selection, Julia was always thinking about how to escape from this guy's control. But now, when she suddenly heard that Eric wasn't going to care about her anymore, Julia felt a sense of emptiness. "Hey look, it's the Bridge of Sighs." Just as the two of them were thinking about their own matters, Elizabeth suddenly shouted in English. Eric looked up in the direction Elizabeth was pointing. In a narrow water alley, there was a completely sealed white stone arch bridge that looked like a loft. The boatman named Loviso smiled as he waved the oars and rowed the gondola into the water alley. Bridge of Sighs. What a beautiful name. Julia, do you know about the legend of the Bridge of Sighs? Elizabeth sighed with emotion like an artistic youth before turning to ask Julia. Julia shook her head in confusion. She really didn't know. It wasn't like the era of extremely advanced information 10 or 20 years later, where everything could be found by clicking on a web page and typing a few words. Seeing Julia shake her head, Elizabeth proudly waved her little hand and explained. Look, this kind of arch bridge connects two buildings. This side is the Doge's Palace in Venice, and this side is the prison for felons. It is said that after the trial in the Doge's Palace, the prisoners who were sent to this prison rarely came out alive. Therefore, the prisoners who cross this bridge will always sigh with regret, and thus the name of the Bridge of Sighs. Eric took a few photos, put down the camera, and said with a smile, After hearing what you said, I think it's more appropriate to rename this bridge to Hell's Gate. If this bridge had a life, after being blessed by the sighs of so many felons, its heart would definitely be filled with all kinds of violent emotions. In the movies, it would be the typical villain who felt that the whole world had let him down, and would commit all kinds of crimes against humanity and society. Elizabeth's excited movements paused for a moment. She actually felt that Eric's words made sense. However, the girl soon rolled her eyes at Eric. Hey, can you stop being such a killjoy? I'm just telling the truth. Elizabeth turned her head angrily, intending to ignore this detestable guy. She held Julia's arm and whispered to her. The gondola slowly drifted under the Bridge of Sighs. The boatman standing at the stern raised his voice slightly and said a few words in Italian to the three of them. Both Eric and Julia looked at Elizabeth in confusion. The girl raised her chin a little smugly and translated. Mr. Loviso said that if couples kiss under the Bridge of Sighs, they can obtain everlasting love. When Julia heard this, she secretly glanced at Eric, but it was just a glance, and she lowered her eyes guiltily. Elizabeth, on the other hand, couldn't help but stand up slightly, her eyes darting between Eric and Julia, eager to give it a try. Seeing Elizabeth's expression, Eric playfully put his hands in front of him and said sternly, Don't even think about it. I'll never kiss you. Get lost. Even if this bridge collapses, I won't kiss you, bad guy. Elizabeth retorted with one hand on her waist, not to be outdone. After that, she rolled her big eyes, and under Eric's astonished gaze, she hugged the defenseless Julia and leaned over to kiss her. Chapter 204. Although the boatman named Loviso, who was standing at the stern of the boat, was in his 50s and had white hair and beard, it was clearly the first time he had seen the two girls kissing under the Bridge of Sighs. He was stunned for a moment before he burst into laughter and gave Elizabeth and Julia a thumbs up. At the same time, he winked at Eric gloatingly and said a few words loudly. Although Eric couldn't understand, he could guess that the old man was gloating. The other party must have thought that he was trying to date one of the girls but was robbed by the other. He could only grin awkwardly, unable to explain due to the language barrier. However, the scene of the two girls kissing under the Bridge of Sighs was quite beautiful. After Eric laughed, he couldn't help but raise his camera and snap a few times to save the image. Julia's eyes widened as she felt Elizabeth hug her waist and kiss her. She was stunned for more than half a minute. Only when she heard the shutter of Eric's camera did she come back to her senses. She pushed away the girl hugging her in a fluster and protested at a loss. Liz, how can you do this? When Elizabeth saw Julia's blushing coquettishly, she couldn't help but hug the girl's waist and kiss Julia's cheek. Then she raised her head and said to Eric overbearingly, Eric, Julia is mine from now on. You're not allowed to bully her anymore. Before Eric could answer, Julia became unhappy. Liz, what nonsense are you talking about? As Julia spoke, she reached out and pinched Elizabeth's waist. Elizabeth screamed and fought back. The two of them were in a mess for a moment, and the small gondola shook because of the two girls' nonsense. The old boatman, Loviso, was so frightened that he hurriedly shouted for them to stop. Only then did Julia and Elizabeth stop. The three of them spent the entire morning strolling along the Grand Canal. After lunch, Eric asked the local guide and took a water bus to a relatively famous mask shop in Venice. "I don't like these things." That was the first thing Elizabeth said as she walked into the shop and looked at the various masks hanging on the walls. Some were plain and some were gorgeous. "Why?" Eric took off a golden mask without a mouth and asked admiringly. Elizabeth, who was beside Eric, said, "I've seen the introduction. It said that these masks were originally worn by nobles and fugitives. They symbolize disguise and pretense." "Oh, do you think that without these, people wouldn't wear masks when interacting with each other?" Eric replied casually. He put down the simple Bauta mask and took out a white ghost mask with golden patterns. He pulled Julia over and put it on the girl's face before looking around. When Elizabeth heard Eric's words, she was stunned for a moment. She couldn't help but retort, of course there is, but at least it won't be so obvious. You're just struggling with the question of whether it's true or false." "Actually, it's hard to say. You see, I'm not wearing a mask, but in fact I'm wearing one. In order not to be seen through, I won't tell others whether I'm wearing a mask or not. But if someone really puts on these masks, you'll be able to tell at a glance. Oh, that guy is wearing a mask." When they're serious, those who wear masks on their faces are more honest, while those who wear masks behind their smiles are more hypocritical. Elizabeth carefully pondered over Eric's words. Although she couldn't help but agree with what he said, her little mouth was still unforgiving. You're just changing the concept. Think whatever you want." Eric waved at the shop owner who was waiting by the side. "Excuse me, do you speak English?" "Of course." The shop owner, who was in his 40s and had a small mustache, nodded and asked in fluent English, "Sir, which one do you like?" Eric looked around and said, "I want to buy the full set, including the hat and cloak. But I don't think I've seen those." "Follow me." The shop owner nodded and directly led Eric to a room next to him. "Here, please feel free to do as you please." As the shop owner spoke, he didn't introduce them too eagerly. He took the initiative to leave the room and return to the back of the counter. Eric didn't mind. In fact, he preferred to be able to choose the goods on his own. He took out the hat, cloak, folding fan, and other small items and dressed Julia as a mannequin. "Hey, you're so rude. You didn't even ask if Julia was willing to be manipulated by you." Elizabeth jumped out to express her dissatisfaction. The masked Julia quickly shook her head. It's okay." Eric proudly raised his chin at Elizabeth. The girl was so angry that she stomped her feet. She glared at Julia, who didn't take a stand, and thought to herself, "Serves you right for being bullied." A moment later, after Eric's disguise, Julia was completely covered under the mask and cloak. The white wide-brimmed hat was decorated with purple feathers, and below it was a purple cloak embroidered with gorgeous golden patterns. A lavender scarf was wrapped around her neck, and she was wearing black long-sleeve gloves and holding a purple silk folding fan in her hand. "How is it?" Eric asked as he pulled Julia to the fitting room. "Very, very beautiful." Julia nodded as she looked at herself in the mirror through the mask. Elizabeth also came over. Although her eyes were obviously moved, she still asked, "Why is it purple?" "Purple represents mystery. Don't you think it matches the style of the mask? I still think white is prettier." Elizabeth pointed at a white cloak hanging on the shelf. Eric smiled and said, "Then let's get a white set together later." After that, Eric instructed Julia to take off the mask and cloak, and let the shop owner help wrap it up. Then, Eric spent another hour collecting several other sets of different styles. Elizabeth helped take off a hat and handed it to Eric. She asked, "Why did you buy so many?" Eric replied, "As a gift. Since I'm in Venice, I have to bring some gifts back." Elizabeth smirked and said, "For a woman, right?" Eric smiled non-committally. Seeing Eric's tacit expression, Elizabeth's movements paused for a moment. Then she scolded in disdain, "What a playboy!" When Julia, who was sandwiched in the middle and wearing the mask, heard the conversation between Eric and Elizabeth, her originally excited eyes dimmed. After collecting 5 sets, Eric walked up to pay the bill. After asking what kind of currency to pay, the shop owner calculated and looked up with a smile. It's a total of $2,200. I'll just charge you $2,000. Eric, who had already taken out his wallet, looked at the shop owner in confusion. The shop owner took the initiative to explain, I really liked what you said about the mask when you first entered the shop, so I'll give you a discount. Eric smiled and said, Thank you. After walking out of the shop with a few bags, Eric stuffed a bag into Julia's hands and looked at the other bag to confirm before handing it to Elizabeth. I don't want to help you carry things. Elizabeth quickly put her little hands in her jeans pocket and raised her chin proudly. Don't you like this white set? This is for you. Do you want it? If not, I'll give it to Julia. It'll be a waste if you don't want it. Elizabeth immediately snatched it. Eric took the lead and walked to the water bus station with the remaining 3 bags. Elizabeth, who was following closely behind, went up to Julia and asked, Julia, what's yours like? Although Eric did not say it explicitly, Julia already knew that the set in her hands was a gift from Eric. She opened it and took a look, then hugged it in her arms and said to Elizabeth, It's the purple set from the beginning. Elizabeth pouted and said unhappily, Why are you hugging it so tightly? It's not like I'm going to snatch it from you. Julia quickly walked over to Eric, ignoring Elizabeth's teasing. Elizabeth had no choice but to speed up and catch up. Eric, will you still come out to play tomorrow? Elizabeth took the initiative to ask while sitting on the boat. Julia also raised her head and looked at Eric expectantly. Eric shook his head and said, I'm afraid I won't have time for the opening ceremony tomorrow. Then, when can you find time to tell me about your movie? I can earn hundreds of thousands every minute. Eric pretended to look troubled, but the girl pinched his arm rudely. After Elizabeth pinched him, Eric and Julia were slightly stunned. They both looked at Eric's arm. Eric was only wearing a black sleeveless t-shirt, so there were faint pinch marks on his arm. This was not the main point of the matter. The main point was, this kind of intimate and coquettish action was usually only done between couples. However, Elizabeth obviously did not realize this. When she saw their expressions, she said angrily, What's wrong? He deserves it. All he knows is how to make money all day long. What a vulgar guy. After the girl finished speaking, she angrily turned her head to the side, as if she did not want to talk to Eric anymore. Julia, who was originally a little jealous, saw Eric's slightly awkward expression, and she also lowered her head. There was a mysterious smile on her lips. Ayaya, my legs are so sore. When they returned to the Lido Island Hotel, Elizabeth put down the bag that Eric gave her and pounced directly on the sofa. She turned her head and said to Julia, who came in later, Julia, can you help me massage my legs? I'll help you later. Otherwise, my legs will definitely hurt tomorrow. Okay. Julia sat down on the other end of the sofa. She lifted Elizabeth's legs and placed them on her thighs. She then gently rubbed them. Elizabeth moaned a few times comfortably and muttered, No, I have to think of a way to get that guy to spare some time for me. I don't want to carelessly deal with the thesis. Julia rubbed Elizabeth's legs and thought for a while before saying, Liz, you've been bickering with Eric all day long. Have you thought of a possibility? Elizabeth snorted in confusion without turning her head. Julia smiled and said, If you watch movies or TV series often, you will realize that there is a kind of couple called quarrelsome lovers. Elizabeth's little head turned a little, then she jumped up from the sofa. She stepped on the sofa and waved her arms wildly. Impossible. Chapter 205. In her daze, Julia seemed to hear a sound coming from the living room. She hugged her pillow and turned over, wanting to continue sleeping. However, after turning over, the sound seemed to become clearer. The girl opened her eyes reluctantly after a while. A faint light shone through the curtains. She turned on the light and looked at her wristwatch that was set to Venice's local time. It was past 5 in the morning. She lifted the blanket, put on her slippers, and grabbed her hair as she walked to the living room. Only then did she see the situation clearly. The lights in the living room weren't turned on, and the curtains leading to the balcony were tightly drawn. Only the flickering light of the television made a slight sound. Elizabeth hugged a pillow and sat cross-legged on the sofa with a bag of potato chips in her hand. She was staring at the television intently. At the same time, her small mouth was making light crunching sounds. In the dim light, she looked like a mouse that came out to steal food in the middle of the night. Liz, what's wrong with you? You're up so early. Julia walked to Elizabeth's side and sat down. She pulled a blanket from the sofa and wrapped it around her body. Elizabeth swallowed the snack in her mouth and said softly, I didn't sleep at all. I can't sleep. Julia leaned toward Elizabeth and asked in confusion, Insomnia? Why? After saying this, Julia suddenly remembered. Could it be because of what I said last night? I was just joking. Did you take it seriously? Elizabeth stammered a few times before whispering into Julia's ear. Julia, do you think that bastard has been secretly seducing me? Julia heard Elizabeth's words and blinked quickly a few times. Then she burst out laughing. Liz, you didn't sleep the entire night because you were thinking about these things? In the dim light, Elizabeth's face turned red from Julia's laughter. She scratched the girl a few times in dissatisfaction before saying, How can you be like this? I'm asking you this question very seriously. After laughing, Julia was about to reply, but when she saw Elizabeth's expression, the corners of her mouth couldn't help but curl up. Hey, I'm angry. Elizabeth was about to jump up, but Julia hurriedly held her down and shook her head. Impossible, you don't know that guy at all. When Elizabeth saw that Julia was no longer laughing, she steadied herself. When she heard Julia's answer, she asked unhappily, Do you understand? I don't know much about him. Julia shook her head and said, But I do know one thing. Ha! Elizabeth grabbed Julia's arm. Hurry up and tell me. Don't keep me in suspense. Julia stared at Elizabeth's beautiful face. Although she hadn't slept the whole night, there wasn't the slightest hint of tiredness on her young face. When it comes to women, he has always been rude and unreasonable. If he wants a woman, he won't bother to use any roundabout methods. He's more likely to drag you into the room and press you directly on the wound. As the girl spoke, she couldn't help but think of that night. That guy's imposing manner made it hard for people to refuse. She didn't know why, but she felt a slight warmth in her heart. Elizabeth opened her mouth slightly and said, He wouldn't dare to do that to me. Otherwise, my father wouldn't let him off. Maybe, Julia said softly in the dim light. But in her heart, Julia didn't think much of Elizabeth's confidence. With Eric's current wealth and status, if he really got this girl, maybe old Murdoch would be happy to hear about it. 4 News Corporation, which was still in the development stage in the television and film circles, Eric was the most suitable marriage partner. Elizabeth didn't hear the strange tone in Julia's voice and said, So he's not interested in me, right? Of course. Julia nodded with a smile. Elizabeth breathed a sigh of relief, as if she had finally let go of the matter that had been weighing on her mind all night. However, after a moment, the girl suddenly muttered in dissatisfaction. How can he not be interested in me? Am I not beautiful enough? Ha ha. Julia burst out laughing again. Elizabeth also immediately realized her slip of the tongue. When she saw Julia laughing beside her, she angrily reached out her small hand to grab the girl. Don't scratch me. Julia quickly begged for mercy. She took a few deep breaths and said, I suddenly remembered something that guy once told me. Without waiting for Elizabeth to react, Julia continued, He said that women are very troublesome creatures. When you get close to her, she will mock you and speak rudely. When you stay away from her, she will complain about you. This sentence is really too apt to describe you, hee. Seeing that Elizabeth was about to go crazy again, Julia hurriedly stopped the lady's actions. Okay, stop, Liz, it's not dawn yet. You should sleep for a while. Otherwise, you'll be listless for the whole day. Ugh. I'm going to sleep. Elizabeth immediately grabbed Julia, who was about to get up, and said, No, you can't leave me alone. Julia was pulled back to the sofa by Elizabeth and said helplessly, Then what do you want? Why don't we go out for a run? Anyway, it's already dawn outside. Julia immediately shook her head. It's too early now. There aren't many people on the road. Who knows how public security is here? Italy is the birthplace of the mafia. Maybe you'll be put in a sack as you run. Then, you'll be in trouble. Although Julia was joking, Elizabeth was still frightened by the thought of certain scenes. Then let's watch TV. I can't sleep anyway. After saying that, the woman eagerly stuffed the remote control into Julia's hand. Okay, you're really like a child. Julia helplessly took the remote control. At this time, an Italian soap opera was playing on the TV. Julia couldn't understand it, so she pressed the button to change the channel. After changing several channels in a row, finally, the sound of canned laughter came from the TV. Julia temporarily stopped changing the channel. After listening to a few lines of dialogue, Elizabeth immediately said, "It's my family's TV station. It's a sitcom. That's it. You can understand it." Julia also recognized the Fox TV station logo, so she put down the remote control. The TV scene was in a coffee shop. A few protagonists were discussing the issue of a male lead named Ross's wife inexplicably becoming a lesbian. After a few witty lines, Julia and Elizabeth were attracted by the plot. Then, the female lead named Phoebe's action of grabbing bad luck from the head of the dispirited Ross made the two girls laugh. "Seriously, it's too funny. Why didn't I know there was such a sitcom?" Elizabeth said as she slapped her thigh. Julia was also laughing, but she quickly reacted and said, "It should be about 8 o'clock in the evening in the Eastern Time. This should be a new TV series. Otherwise, we would have definitely heard of such an interesting sitcom." Elizabeth nodded in agreement. "Yes, remember the name later. I'll keep watching it in the future." As the two were talking, Ross said to his sister, Monica, on the TV, "I don't want to be single. I just want to get married again." As soon as he said that, the sound of footsteps could be heard. The door of the coffee shop was pushed open, and a wet bride in a wedding dress barged in. Everyone looked at Ross and the bride in surprise. Then, Chandler waved his hand expectantly at the door and said loudly, "I just want $1 million. This time, of course, his wish did not come true. Chandler waved his hand a few times and stuck out his tongue awkwardly. "Ha ha ha, it's so funny." Elizabeth, who was on the sofa, saw the scene and almost bent over in laughter. She raised her head again and inadvertently glanced at Julia next to her. However, she saw the girl's dumbfounded expression. "Hey Julia, what's wrong with you?" Elizabeth reached out and poked Julia's waist. Julia pointed at the TV screen. "Look, that bride in the wedding dress is Jennifer Aniston." Elizabeth didn't react. She looked at where Julia was pointing and nodded. "She's a very beautiful girl. What's wrong?" You still don't remember, Liz?" Julia continued, "Jennifer Aniston. She's that guy's girlfriend. That means this TV series is the one that the media has been promoting a while ago. It's the one that he personally directed." Elizabeth's mouth suddenly opened slightly. She recalled a few scenes in Dark War. There was indeed a scene that matched the coffee shop in the TV screen. "Friends?" Julia nodded slightly. She was still very concerned about Eric's news. Therefore, when Eric's TV series started promoting, she knew his name. Elizabeth and Julia looked at each other for a while before they pouted in dissatisfaction. "Why is he everywhere?" The corners of Julia's mouth curled up into a smile. She thought for a moment and said, It seems like today is the premiere of Friends." Because of certain emotions in the hearts of the two girls, although the corners of their mouths twitched from time to time, they did not laugh as loudly as they did at the beginning. However, their eyes never left the TV screen. Even when there were commercials in the middle of the episode, the two of them did not walk away. At the end of the second episode, Jennifer Aniston's character, Rachel, called her bridesmaid and wished that the child she had with her ex-fiancé would grow an ugly rosacea nose and bald head like its parents. Elizabeth spoke again. "This woman is so cheap. I don't like her." Chapter 206. Julia didn't know how to respond to Elizabeth's words. Although the girl's tone was indifferent, as if she was just evaluating the characters in the show, Julia could hear a hint of jealousy in her voice. In fact, how could Julia not be a little jealous herself? Although she had only watched 2 episodes, she could tell that with the quality of Friends, this TV series would definitely be a hit. Jennifer Aniston's character, Rachel, would definitely be the most popular among the 6 people. The impact of this TV series would definitely be greater than that of a popular movie. Eric is so good to me, Julia thought in her heart. She felt a little sad and self-pitying. That guy is so good to his girlfriend. Why can't he be more gentle and considerate to me? If he treats me like that too, then... The TV had already started to play the commercials. By the time the two of them reacted, the sky was already bright. Julia stood up and stretched. She hurriedly washed up and walked out of the bathroom. Liz, do you want to go to the restaurant downstairs for breakfast? Elizabeth shook her head. I'm a little tired. I don't feel like going out. Julia, can you bring me a fruit salad? Julia nodded. She put on her clothes and walked out of the hotel. In the room, Elizabeth stared at the TV screen for a while. Finally, she stood up and picked up the phone. She recalled for a while and skillfully dialed a series of numbers based on her memory. A few minutes later, Julia returned to the room with 2 packed breakfasts. When she saw Elizabeth put down the phone, she asked casually, "Who were you calling?" "New York," Elizabeth replied. Seeing that Julia didn't seem interested, the girl walked to the sofa and sat down. She said, "I just called Fox headquarters in New York. The ratings for Friends are out." Julia opened the 2 boxes of salad and pushed one to Elizabeth. She then stood up and went to the fridge to get 2 cartons of milk. Hearing Elizabeth's words, Julia said indifferently, "Why are you asking about this? The ratings for a TV series written by Eric will definitely not be low. Maybe it will reach 20 million viewers when it airs." 31.7 million. Elizabeth said softly. Her voice was a little hoarse, as if something was stuck in her throat. She studied media. Compared to laymen, she could understand the meaning of this number better. "Oh." Julia dropped the milk into the glass and responded casually. Then she suddenly raised her head and asked with widened eyes, "How much did you just say?" Elizabeth pulled the fruit salad in front of her and said with her head lowered, "The average viewership of the 2 episodes is 31.7 million, and the highest viewership is 35 million. It's really incredible. Oh my God." Julia took a few sips of milk to suppress the shock in her heart. Could it be a mistake? How could there be a mistake? The TV station headquarters have gone crazy. He was indeed crazy. After Fox released the viewership ratings for the first 2 episodes of Friends, even though it was already late at night, the news spread like wildfire throughout the film and television industry within an hour. Countless newspapers began to rewrite their articles, and countless phones rang. Many people who were already asleep were woken up. In this era, the main means of audiovisual entertainment for people were movies and television. Therefore, viewership ratings of more than 30 million people were not rare. However, to achieve this result, it was either an important ceremony or competition, or a major plot twist or finale of a popular TV series that had accumulated popularity for several years. A TV series that had just started broadcasting and had already achieved such amazing results was something that had never happened before. More importantly, Fox was a TV station that had just developed for less than 10 years. Although it was already ranked 4th in North America, it was still a far cry from the top 3 TV stations. It was even more difficult to achieve such results. Before Friends, Fox's highest viewership rating record was an interview with Michael Jackson, and that only had 19 million viewers. Once Friends was released, it directly increased Fox's highest viewership rating record by more than 10 million. As the person who caused all of this, Eric was woken up early in the morning by the incessant ringing of the phone in his room. It was not even 7 o'clock yet. The first call was from Barry Diller himself. Barry Diller told him about the viewership ratings of Friends and expressed his congratulations. Then he hoped that Eric could return to the United States as soon as possible. The chairman of News Corporation, Rupert Murdoch, would arrive in Los Angeles in 2 days and wanted to meet Eric in person. After chatting for more than 10 minutes, Barry Diller repeatedly urged Eric to return to Los Angeles as soon as possible before reluctantly hanging up the phone. Eric put down the phone. Before he had time to carefully think about the news that Barry Diller brought, the phone rang. The second was Jeffrey, then the third, the fourth, the fifth. For the next 2 hours, Eric spent his time repeatedly answering the phone. Both of his ears were slightly itchy because of the long-term stimulation. It was not until 9 o'clock in the morning that Eric finally couldn't stand it anymore and pulled out the phone line. The whole world was quiet. Anyway, most of the more important people had already called, and it didn't matter if the rest of them answered or not. Moreover, many people called with ulterior motives. Except for Jennifer Aniston, who called in a hurry and sincerely congratulated him. Many others called for the broadcast rights of Friends. For the sake of insurance, Fox only booked the first season of Friends. This was no secret. Now, Friends had achieved such amazing results even though it had just started broadcasting. Even if the ratings would fluctuate greatly in the future, with a viewership of more than 30 million viewers, the ratings in the future would not be that bad. Under such circumstances, if the other 3 major television stations in North America were indifferent to Friends, then there was no need for the person at the helm of the television station to continue sitting in that position. These people were indeed resourceful. In just a few hours, they found representatives to express their intentions to Eric. NBC even found 3 lobbyists: Jennifer Aniston, James Brooks, and Robert Shea. Except for Jennifer Aniston, who originally worked for NBC, Eric couldn't figure out how the other 2 got in touch with NBC. It seemed that James Brooks was a famous producer who maintained a close relationship with Fox. Weren't they afraid of being found out? Robert Shea's actions made Eric even more confused. As for the results of Friends, it wasn't that Eric didn't have his own estimates. Because Dark Battle was still in theaters, the 3 episodes of Friends that were aired during this period of time had aroused strong curiosity from the public. In addition, Eric had personally written the script and directed the first 2 episodes himself, as well as Fox's relentless promotion. Eric had previously estimated that the premiere viewership of Friends would definitely be in the 20 million range. Otherwise, it would be a waste of the series of hype he had put into this series. However, when the viewership of more than 3,000 came out, Eric was greatly surprised. For the viewership of an American TV series, 10 million to 20 million viewers was a very easy quantitative change. As long as it was a popular TV series, the viewership would fluctuate with the plot and reach 20 million viewers from time to time. However, the jump from 20 million to 30 million viewership ratings was a very difficult qualitative change. Only a very small number of popular American TV series could achieve such amazing results once or twice at a certain stage after accumulating popularity for several years. Now, Friends was just the beginning, and it had already created a miracle. This was enough to be recorded in the history of TV series development. Therefore, this incident caused a sensation in the entire North American film and television industry. Chapter 207. Early the next morning, headlines such as Friends, 30 million, and Miracle of Viewership appeared in a large number of newspapers in North America. All kinds of comments also appeared in front of People. The spoiled and indecisive Rachel Green, the competitive and misophobic Monica Geller, the eccentric Phoebe Buffy, the calculative Ross Geller, the humorous Chandler Bing, the simple-minded Joey Tribbiani. In just 2 episodes, Eric Williams used simple and trivial scenes to create 6 distinct on-screen characters for us. In just an hour, the audience fell in love with these 6 virtual characters. A plot that is close to reality and full of humor can resonate with the audience. The 31.7 million premiere of Friends once again proved this point. When the audience saw the 6 protagonists living in a New York apartment, it was as if they saw their own shadows in their lives. This may be the most important factor for the success of this sitcom. Just like ABC's Growing Pains, which is still popular, Eric Williams is indeed a genius. He can easily piece together the details of life into interesting dialogues and firmly capture the audience's attention. The interesting dialogues between the protagonists of Friends will undoubtedly become a popular phrase among young people for a long time. In just 2 episodes, the personalities of the 6 protagonists have been fully developed. I'm more and more looking forward to the next plot. I believe that Eric Williams, who is the scriptwriter, will definitely bring more surprises to the audience in terms of the plot. There is no doubt about that. After all, he is Eric Williams. Among the countless praises there were, of course, many different opinions. After a simple survey, Los Angeles Metropolitan News said that through a random interview with the audience of Friends, they found that less than 60% of the audience were very satisfied with the plot. More than 20% of the audience interviewed said that Friends did not meet their expectations. The remaining 20% of the audience thought that the quality of Friends was average. Therefore, the Los Angeles Metropolitan News article concluded that the 30 million viewership miracle of Friends was entirely the result of a series of previous hype. The results of the investigation indicated that the quality of Friends obviously did not meet the expectations of many viewers who were full of expectations for Eric Williams. Following this, the ratings would definitely plummet. More than one newspaper like Los Angeles Metropolitan News were pessimistic about the ratings of Friends. However, such statements were generally only used to fool ordinary people. As long as one had a little bit of professional knowledge, they would understand that although the ratings miracle of Friends was aided by the hype, if the quality of the show itself was not good enough, it would not have reached an average of 31.7 million viewers. Just 2 episodes of Friends had already proved its popularity. With a viewership base of more than 30 million viewers, even if there was a big decline in ratings, the viewership would definitely be more than 2,000 viewers. For a TV series, a viewership of more than 20 million viewers was definitely a super hit. The 3 established television stations in North America, ABC, NBC, and CBS, did not pay much attention to Fox. The youngest of the 3 television stations, ABC, had already been in development for half a century. NBC and CBS had even longer histories. Over the years, more than one media group had tried to challenge the position of the 3 television stations, but without exception, they all ended in failure. Therefore, even if News Corporation invited Barry Diller, who was known as the pride of the media industry, to be responsible for the establishment of the television network business, and even if Fox had established the 4th largest television network in the United States in just a few years, in the eyes of the 3 television stations, Fox was still a newcomer in the North American television circle. After all, no matter how the scale of the expansion, the television station ultimately relied on the viewership of the program to speak. However, Fox had not had any television programs in the past few years. Before Friends, the highest viewership record of Fox did not even exceed 20 million viewers. The highest viewership record of the 3 television stations that jointly own the Super Bowl broadcast rights was more than 100 million. Even in normal times, the 3 television stations could easily produce a few ace programs with viewership ratings of more than 20 million. Therefore, although News Corporation had made a lot of noise in North America, and Rupert Murdoch had deliberately become an American citizen in order to gain the power to establish a television network, the 3 television stations had a cold attitude towards the upstart from Australia, waiting for the other party to return in defeat like the other challengers. The appearance of Friends with more than 30 million viewers made the executives of the 3 television stations completely alert. They discovered that unknowingly, Fox's television network, which had only been established for a few years, had more than 100 network television stations, covering more than 90% of the United States. The first reaction of the 3 television stations was that they absolutely could not allow Fox to continue to develop. After all, the size of the television market in the United States was fixed. If Fox rose, it would definitely mean that the market share of the 3 television stations would be greatly reduced. The executives of the 3 major TV stations had a rare emergency meeting. After several hours of discussion, the first countermeasure they came up with was to take the broadcasting rights of the 2nd season of Friends from Fox at all costs. If possible, they would even take over the remaining episodes of the 1st season of Friends, even if they had to pay a high penalty for Eric Williams. Without Friends, Fox's expansion would definitely slow down again. Then the 3 television stations would have plenty of time to slowly deal with Fox, the outsider, who snatched food from the tiger's mouth. What the executives of the 3 television stations could think of, whether it was Barry Diller, the CEO of Fox, or Rupert Murdoch, the head of News Corporation, they could certainly think of it. Although Eric's films had brought huge benefits to Fox, Rupert Murdoch did not pay too much attention to Eric. He only regarded him as a new director working with Fox, so Murdoch had never met Eric before. But this time it was different. Murdoch's newspaper group had developed to the extreme, and his main ambition was the TV network. Eric's friends had brought an important opportunity for the rapid expansion of his TV network. In addition, the 3 major TV stations were ready to make a move. No matter what, it was necessary for Murdoch to personally come forward to win over Eric. So, on the evening of September 4th, when Eric attended the opening ceremony of the 46th Venice Film Festival, a huge Boeing private jet landed at Venice Marco Polo International Airport. Chapter 208. Thank you. The slim blonde flight attendant smiled and handed him a cocktail. Eric, who was sitting next to the small bar, thanked her softly. At this time he was on the Murdoch family's private jet. Before this, Eric really didn't expect that Murdoch would be eager to send a private jet to pick him up in Venice. However, although the other party's purpose was not simple, since it was a gift, Eric would definitely accept it. Even if it was first class, it was definitely not as comfortable as a fully equipped private jet. After attending the opening ceremony of the Venice Film Festival last night, and the premiere of Island Horror, in the morning, Eric left all the rest to Jonathan Dime and others. He hurriedly boarded the huge Boeing private jet and flew back to Los Angeles. Friends had achieved such amazing results. It would be a lie to say that he was not in a hurry to return to Los Angeles. In addition to his assistant and a deputy manager of Fox TV, there were also 2 girls sitting on the sofa whispering near him, Julia and Elizabeth. Alan and the manager stayed in the other lounge with good eyesight. What are you talking about, Julia? Why do you look so happy? Eric turned around and leaned against the bar counter, trying to find a topic to talk about. Julia looked up and was about to speak, but Elizabeth glared at her. It's none of your business. Ever since she found out about the miraculous ratings of Friends, for some reason, Elizabeth's attitude towards Eric had become even worse. If the topic is related to me, then it's definitely my business, Eric said with a smile. He stood up, walked to the sofa, and sat down casually next to Julia. When Julia saw Eric sit down next to her, she raised her body slightly as if she wanted to avoid him, but she quickly relaxed again. Elizabeth said, "Hey, who told you to sit here?" "Liz, I'm a guest. How can you be so rude?" "As a guest, you should have the self-awareness of a guest," Elizabeth retorted. "You're really not hospitable, Liz. It seems that when I return to Los Angeles, I should mention this to Mr. Murdoch. Maybe he should sign you up for a ladies' etiquette class or something." As Eric spoke, he unknowingly took on the tone of an elder. This made Elizabeth, who was already very unhappy, feel an unknown little flame in her heart. Elizabeth glared at Eric for a while. For a moment, she couldn't find a more sharp retort, so she suddenly stood up and said, "I'm going to rest. Help yourself, Mr. Guest." After the girl finished speaking, she walked to the bedroom in her high heels. At some point, the 2 stewardesses had quietly left. Only Eric and Julia were left in the cabin. The girl glanced at Eric, who was resting comfortably on the sofa with his eyes closed. She straightened her back, but didn't leave. She sat quietly beside Eric, and unknowingly began to enjoy this peaceful atmosphere. These few days in Venice were the longest period of time she spent with Eric outside of work. The girl also found that compared to Eric, who was a bit grumpy and controlling at work, this man was very casual most of the time in private. Even when Elizabeth couldn't help but argue with him, Eric never lost his composure. Instead, it was Elizabeth who was always speechless at his casual rebuttals. In just a few days of getting along, the girl's original image of Eric had changed greatly. At least, he was no longer the demon king in her heart. She didn't know how much time had passed, but Eric still didn't move. Only then did the girl secretly turn her face to look at the man beside her. After a few days of running around, coupled with the lack of rest due to the jet lag, Eric's young face had obvious fatigue. There was also stubble on his chin that he didn't have time to clean. However, Julia couldn't help but feel a little moved by his mature appearance. The girl even had the urge to reach out and touch him. But before she could even make the most basic movements, the impulse in Julia's heart had already turned into a soft sigh. She reached out and took the empty wine glass in Eric's hand and put it aside. Then she sat next to the man again. In her mind, She remembered what Elizabeth said to her after learning about the miraculous ratings of Friends. She only knew that Eric was very, very good. Every movie he made had a high box office. Even if it was his first TV series, he easily created a ratings miracle. But as for how good Eric was, the girl didn't have any specific measure in her heart. It wasn't until Elizabeth, who was more knowledgeable, explained to her that Julia could vaguely imagine the heights that Eric was at now. Eric, who had fallen asleep next to her, moved his body. He seemed to feel that the sleeping position was very uncomfortable, so he fell down on the sofa. His head just happened to rest on the girl's thigh, and one of his hands inadvertently hugged Julia's slender waist. Julia, who was originally thinking, was startled by Eric's action. She thought that Eric was awake, but when she looked down and saw that Eric had found a comfortable position in her arms, he snorted twice and then stopped moving again. The girl finally understood. She chuckled silently and finally mustered the courage to reach out and gently touch the handsome face with her fingertips. The blonde flight attendant who made the drink for Eric not long ago appeared in the cabin again, seemingly wanting to ask if the guests needed anything. When the blonde flight attendant saw the intimate situation of the man and woman on the sofa, her eyes widened slightly. As a young person, of course she knew Julia and Eric, and she usually paid attention to the gossip in the entertainment industry. But at this moment, the blonde flight attendant saw the young and famous director sleeping on the thigh of Julia Roberts, who had become a top actress in Hollywood. The blonde flight attendant was still a bit surprised. Seeing the flight attendant's surprised look, Julia's face was slightly hot, but she reached out and made a gesture to be quiet. This gesture also woke the flight attendant, who fell into a daze. She quickly showed a professional smile to Julia and was about to leave. Julia stopped her and gestured a few times. The flight attendant quickly understood and gently covered Eric with a blanket. Julia only relaxed after the stewardess left. She lowered her head and looked at Eric's sleeping face in a daze. Her thoughts turned and turned and turned. In the end, she thought that she was wearing a pair of jeans made of coarse material today. Would it be uncomfortable for him to stick to it? Because the time difference was 9 hours earlier than Venice. After more than 10 hours of flight, when they arrived in Los Angeles, it was not even 8 o'clock in the evening. The summer sky had just turned completely dark. There were many people who knew that Eric would arrive in Los Angeles at this time, so more than one group of people waited outside the airport. Fortunately, he came back by private jet, and the itinerary was relatively secretive. If he took a passenger plane according to the original plan, he would definitely be blocked by a large wave of reporters who had calculated the time. As soon as Eric's figure appeared, several groups of people waiting outside the airport surrounded him. These people didn't know each other at first, but after seeing each other's actions, they understood the purpose of the others, so they all quickened their steps and moved forward. "Mr. Williams, I'm Mr. Murdoch's assistant." "Mr. Williams, Mr. Eisner asked me to wait for you here." "Eric, we met during the recording of Sophia's talk show. I'm the manager of the Los Angeles branch of CBS." Eric smiled and shook hands with the groups of people who were introducing him. When the crowd quieted down a little, he finally said, "I'm really sorry, I just returned to Los Angeles, and I'm still jet-lagged. Can we talk about it tomorrow?" Of course, these groups of people were not willing to leave just because of Eric's words. They spoke again, and when they saw Eric walking out by himself, they did not dare to pester him too much. Eric had actually expected this situation, but he just did not expect so many people to come to the airport to intercept him. He hurriedly got into a black car specially sent by Jeffrey. After Alan put his luggage in the car, Eric said goodbye to the crowd outside the window. At the same time, he did not forget to wave to Julia and Elizabeth, who were standing outside the crowd. Seeing Eric's car drive away, these people were a little disappointed and ran to their own cars to leave. Elizabeth certainly did not mind when others left, but when she saw that the assistant sent by her father seemed to have the intention of leaving by himself, the little flame in Elizabeth's heart ignited again. She put her hands on her waist and shouted, "Hey Vincent, am I air?" The assistant named Vincent, who was mentioned by Elizabeth, had all his attention on Eric and did not notice Elizabeth, who came out later. He quickly ran over and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, 2nd Mississippi. I just didn't notice you and couldn't pick up Mr. Williams." I don't know how to explain this to Mr. Murdoch. Elizabeth pulled Julia to a luxurious Bentley and said angrily, I don't care how you explain it. Take us back to Beverly Hills first. But, Vincent hesitated and said, Second, miss, I have to report this to Mr. Murdoch as soon as possible. Mr. Murdoch is still waiting at the headquarters in Century City. It's so late. Do you want us two girls to take a taxi back? What if we run into bad guys? Elizabeth said as she stuffed the suitcase that she and Julia were pulling to Vincent. She then pulled Julia into the Bentley and slammed the door shut. Vincent smiled bitterly. He had no choice but to talk to the deputy manager, Fox, who went to Venice to pick up Elizabeth. After stuffing the two suitcases into the trunk, he sat in the front passenger seat and instructed the driver to drive. At the same time, he picked up the mobile phone and dialed a number. Chapter 209. The car sped up on the road. Eric recalled the situation just now and said with some emotion, I didn't expect that in addition to the major TV stations, even a cable channel like HBO would come. However, why did Michael Eisner send someone here? Friends had achieved impressive results. As Eric's assistant, coupled with the sense of superiority from being chased by a group of people just now, Alan was slightly excited. Hearing Eric's question, he thought for a moment and said, I think Mr. Eisner should have come forward on behalf of ABC. Eric instantly remembered the acquisition of ABC by Disney in his previous life. However, although Eric couldn't remember when Disney acquired ABC in his previous life, it must have been many years before now. Why would Michael Eisner come forward on behalf of ABC now? Noticing Eric's puzzled expression from the rearview mirror, Alan took the initiative to explain. The relationship between Disney and ABC has always been very close. I've been watching Disney cartoons on ABC since I was a child. Eric was a little surprised, and then said, Alan, help me sort out the information between Disney and ABC in the next 2 days. After thinking for a moment, he added, Give me a copy of the relationship between the other major TV stations and the 7 big Hollywood studios. No problem, but it may take about a week. Alan turned his head and said, Don't worry, you do it slowly. The most important thing is to be accurate. I understand, Eric. Where are we going now? Alan asked again. In front of outsiders, Alan always called Eric Mr. Williams. However, in private, he called Eric's name directly. This was specially instructed by Eric. After all, Alan was almost 30 years old, almost 10 years older than Eric's body. If he called Eric seriously in private, even Eric himself would feel very awkward. Eric didn't even think about it and said directly, Go home. It's already night. Nothing is urgent. There's no need to disturb others now. I'll go back and give Jeffrey and the others a call. Back at the mansion in Beverly Hills, Alan and the driver helped Eric move his luggage into the villa. The little girl, who had been waiting for Eric to come back, did not wait for the outsiders to leave. She rushed to the pile of luggage and began to look for gifts. Eric dotingly knocked on the little girl's head a few times before sending Ellen and the driver away. As for the arrangements for the next few days, if it's about Fox's invitation, find an excuse to help me turn it down. If other TV stations have contact, arrange a time to meet. Standing at the door of the villa, Eric said to Alan by the car. Alan also knew that Eric was waiting for a good price among the major TV stations, but he still asked doubtfully, Eric, what if Murdoch comes to you personally? He won't, Eric said confidently. Previously, when he sent his private jet to pick me up in Venice, Fox was just expressing his sincerity for the upcoming negotiations. Moreover, doing so still made him seem a little impatient. If old Murdoch can't help but come to me in person, then of course, I won't hesitate to kill him. Eric, do you plan to change TV stations for Friends? Alan smiled and asked, but he regretted it after speaking. This question was a bit sensitive. Of course, Eric couldn't tell Alan his plans. Although Alan had always been more conscientious, it was hard to guarantee that he wouldn't be tempted by the benefits and reveal some things. If you want a person to remain loyal, the most important thing is to try not to give the other party enough bargaining chips to betray you. If the opponent knew some of his plans through Alan, then it would be difficult for Eric to obtain the greatest benefits from it. However, he also saw from Alan's expression that the other party didn't mean to ask this question. So he smiled and said, "This definitely depends on the price of all parties. We must choose the one with the highest price." Alan nodded and didn't ask any more questions. He quickly left. When he returned to the villa, the phone in the living room had been picked up by Drew, so Eric had to call again for an hour or two, just like the morning when the ratings of Friends were released. This time, Rupert Murdoch also called in person and invited Eric to lunch the next day. Eric casually found a few reasons to reject the other party. He planned to at least make contact with the other major television stations to put on an act and make Fox feel a sense of urgency before discussing the deal. Only then would he be able to maximize the benefits. Although the other major TV stations were so enthusiastic, Eric didn't plan to change TV stations for Friends from the beginning. Compared to the young Fox, the other major TV stations were more like white-haired old men. Even if they lowered themselves to cooperate with Eric, it was inevitable that they would take advantage of their seniority. Fox was different. Eric knew that in his previous life, Fox had developed into a giant in the North American television industry with the 3 major TV stations in just over 10 years. But except for Eric himself, even Murdoch, the head of Fox News Corporation, couldn't possibly know this, and at the same time, couldn't have enough confidence in the future of Fox. In this case, the importance of Friends to Fox was extraordinary. The next day, the first thing Eric did was to visit the set of Friends. At noon, with Michael Eisner's help, he had lunch with a vice president of ABC TV who specially came to Los Angeles. In the evening, he was dragged by Robert Shea to meet an executive of NBC. On the morning of September 7th, he was dragged by the manager of the Los Angeles branch of CBS to play golf for the whole morning. It had to be said that the 3 major TV stations were very generous. They didn't even mention buying the series at a fixed price. Instead, they directly offered to participate in the advertising share of the TV series. And according to Eric's information, the percentage of shares offered by the other party was quite high. At the same time, the 3 major TV stations revealed that they wanted to intercept Fox and take over the next episodes of the first season of Friends. Through these contacts, Eric also found that the 3 major TV stations must have reached some consensus before, and might even have formed a loose alliance. However, this alliance was so fragile that it could be blown away by a gust of wind. The 3 major TV stations were all in a fierce competition with each other. Although there would be cooperation, it was just like how they would not allow the other 2 TV stations to get their hands on their ace show. They also had their own thoughts on the matter of Friends, because with the viewership ratings of Friends, it was destined to become the ace show of any TV station. Although the 3 TV stations had reached a consensus, they were attacking separately. As a result, Eric was able to smoothly implement his plan without too much pressure. After all, if the 3 TV giants in North America put pressure on him together, he would definitely have to consider the consequences of offending all 3 TV stations. Chapter 210. Although most of his attention was still on Friends, Eric did not give up on his company and movie. On the 3rd day after returning to Los Angeles, Eric, Jeffrey, and Robert went to the new location they chose for Firefly film. "Eric, what do you think of this place?" The 3 of them got out of a commercial vehicle and Robert Shea pointed to a 7-story building near the highway. Eric looked up and sized up the building. The exterior of the building was silver and full of metallic texture. There were not many high-rise buildings in Los Angeles other than the city center, so this 7-story office building in Burbank was more in line with Eric's expectations. But after a while, Eric pointed to the busy highway behind them and said, "Robert, this place is close to the highway. Will it be too noisy?" "No," Robert Shea shook his head and said. "Jeffrey and I have visited every floor before. The soundproofing inside is very good. If the windows are closed, you can't hear the sound of the car outside at all. Also, look, we can also buy the land north of this building. It's about 10,000 square feet in total. If we need it in the future, we can build a few more office buildings closer to it. That way, we won't have to worry about the noise problem." Eric subconsciously calculated the area mentioned by Robert Shea. This piece of land was about 1,000 square meters. According to the map handed by the assistant, it was rectangular, about 400 meters from north to south, and less than 300 meters from east to west. If that's the case, why didn't you build the office building further away from the highway? Eric looked up and asked after looking at the map. The real estate company that owned this land originally planned to build a small business district here. Unfortunately, after the stock market crashed 2 years ago, the company's capital chain was broken, and they only had time to build this building. So, Eric, if we take over the whole thing now, I think it will be a good investment for Firefly. Eric was a little tempted when he heard this. Firefly would have their first real estate if they bought this place. More importantly, until Eric's rebirth, real estate was a very profitable investment. Even though the North American real estate market had experienced several turbulences such as the subprime mortgage crisis, the overall trend was still rising. How much will it cost to buy it all? Eric asked. $20 million, Robert Shea said. As if he was afraid that Eric would think it was too expensive, Robert Shea added, Eric, this price is definitely acceptable. Look around. You can't find such a large plot of land in Burbank, and it's so well connected. There's a highway right next to it. Eric smiled and turned to look at Jeffrey on the other side. Jeffrey, what do you think? I think the same as Robert. I also suggest that we take over the whole piece of land. Then there will definitely be a lawsuit. During that time, Friends will definitely not be broadcast. Under normal circumstances, this kind of lawsuit would take up to 1.5 years. The 3 major television stations could use this time to deal with Fox and suppress its rising momentum. But in the end, we will also take advantage of the situation because Friends can't be broadcast. When the lawsuit is over, everything will be settled. Who knows if the 3 major TV stations will still honor their initial promise to us? After listening, Robert Shea suggested, then let's not touch the first season and give the broadcasting rights to other TV stations. I've had people estimate that with the scale of the 3 major TV stations, we can get at least a 10% increase in the share of advertising fees. Eric turned to look at Robert Shea and said, Robert, why don't we look at the long term? Even if we get a higher share, we are still in the position of a chess piece. So, since there is such a good opportunity, why not work hard in the direction of the players? Robert Shea was stunned and quickly showed a wry smile. He couldn't help but think, am I old, or is this boy too ambitious? On the coastal road, the purple Lamborghini Ghost was obviously slowed down in the traffic. Sitting in the passenger seat, Jennifer Aniston, wearing a white corset dress, took out the makeup mirror from time to time to check her makeup. Eric, help me take a look. Is there a problem with my makeup? The girl looked at her and tidied up the slanted bangs on her forehead before turning to ask Eric. Eric held the steering wheel and looked at the girl. He quickly turned his head and said, not bad, it's very beautiful. But Jenny, did you choose your own dress? Yeah, isn't it beautiful? If they weren't in the car, Jennifer Aniston would definitely stand up and show off to Eric. Eric held back for a while before saying, I'll call Kapoor tomorrow and ask him to help you find a better stylist. You are a big star now, so you have to learn how to dress up. Okay, Jennifer Aniston heard the word, big star, come out of Eric's mouth. She was obviously very happy, but the girl was not stupid. She quickly understood and asked with some uncertainty, you mean there is a problem with my outfit? Eric nodded gently and said in a gentle tone, in fact, there is no problem. It's just that this dress is more suitable for attending an award ceremony and walking the red carpet. It's not suitable for attending a party. Wow, it seems like it. No, Eric, turn around. I want to go back and change. The girl lowered her head and carefully looked at her dress. She saw that the skirt was obviously too long, and immediately reached out to grab Eric's arm. Hey, don't make trouble. I'm driving. Jennifer Aniston quickly retracted her small hand and said, turn around, I want to go back and change. This is the first time I attend a party with you. I don't want to be laughed at. Eric knocked on the watch on his wrist and said, it's too late. If we go back now, we will definitely be late. Oh. Jennifer Aniston lowered her small head in depression. Then she raised her head and stared at Eric. You must have noticed the problem from the beginning, right? Then why didn't you remind me when we came? I didn't react at the time. I just thought you were beautiful. What do we do now? Eric looked at the road sign outside the window and said, There's a way. This place is quite close to Virginia's villa. If you're willing, we can go to her place to see if there are any suitable dresses. I have the key to her house. No, I'd rather be laughed at. The girl immediately turned her head. Eric shrugged helplessly and said, Then forget it. As long as you are careful at the party and don't trip on the skirt. The celebration party of friends was not chosen at any hotel. Instead, it was held at one of the Murdoch family's manors in Malibu. The sports car arrived at the entrance of the manor. Eric handed the key to the waiter and walked into the manor with Jennifer Aniston. After receiving the news of Eric's arrival, Rupert Murdoch and Barry Diller, who had arrived earlier, came out to greet him. Eric was surprised to see why Elizabeth, who he had not seen for a few days, come out with old Murdoch. Although the girl had a very ladylike smile on her face, Eric saw a faint reluctance on her face. Chapter 211. Looking at Rupert Murdoch, who was less than 60 years old, Eric's deepest impression of the media mogul was undoubtedly from the wiretapping scandal in his previous life. Perhaps because of the wiretapping scandal, the media in his memory chose photos of the other party in a more embarrassing state. But at this time, Murdoch was in high spirits. His little hair was neatly combed, he wore rimless glasses and had a friendly smile on his face. While Eric was looking at the other party, old Murdoch was also carefully examining the young man who was less than 20 years old opposite him. This process didn't last for more than a few seconds, and the two men stretched out their hands at the same time. Hello, Mr. Murdoch, I'm Eric Williams. Although the other party must have seen his appearance in the photo, Eric still introduced himself out of courtesy for the first meeting. Eric, hello. Murdoch shook hands with Eric and then turned to Jennifer Aniston. This must be the beautiful Miss Jennifer Aniston. Your performance in Friends was really wonderful. It was the first time being praised in front of her boyfriend. Jennifer Aniston showed a slightly shy expression and reached out to shake hands with the other party. Thank you, Mr. Murdoch. When Eric and Jennifer Aniston greeted Barry Diller, old Murdoch gave his daughter a look. Elizabeth looked at the intimate couple in front of her and couldn't help feeling a little jealous. After realizing that she was jealous, Elizabeth felt even more uncomfortable. But soon, the girl found a reason for her emotions. She felt that she was feeling injustice for Julia. A few days ago on the plane, she saw Eric sleeping comfortably on Julia's lap. When the guy woke up, Julia, whose legs were numb, sat on the sofa for a long time before she recovered. Julia was so good to him, but in the past few days after returning to Los Angeles, she hadn't seen this guy take the initiative to contact Julia once. Now he appeared with another woman intimately. What a bastard. Hi Liz, you're really beautiful today. Eric greeted Barry Diller before turning to Elizabeth. Hello, Mr. Williams. Elizabeth reached out and shook Eric's hand, looking like she wanted to keep a distance. Then the girl showed a bright smile and intimately pulled Jennifer Aniston, who was beside Eric. Miss Jennifer Aniston, hello, my name is Elizabeth. Wow, your dress is really beautiful. Let's go, I'll take you in. As Elizabeth spoke, she pulled Jennifer Aniston inside. Jennifer Aniston looked at Eric. Although Eric felt that Elizabeth was up to no good, otherwise she wouldn't have specifically mentioned Jennifer Aniston's dress, Eric was sure that Elizabeth wouldn't be too rude on such an occasion. So he nodded to Jennifer Aniston. Only then did Jennifer Aniston obediently let Elizabeth pull her away. His daughter's actions were completely contrary to his previous instructions, which made Murdoch a little angry, but there was nothing he could do. Although Murdoch was busy with his career, he paid a lot of attention to his children because he was almost 60 years old. Although Westerners always refused to admit that they were old, they still had to consider the successor of his media empire. Compared to his eldest daughter who didn't care about her career, and his two younger sons who were still very useless, Elizabeth was undoubtedly the most capable one. When the girl was in school, she successfully established a small local cable television station. However, Elizabeth's character was stubborn and proud, and she always liked to oppose her father on many things. Seeing his daughter casually greeting Eric and pulling his girlfriend away, Murdoch had to say to Eric, "Sorry, Eric, Liz is still a little immature. Let's go in." "Of course, Mr. Murdoch. In fact, I quite like Miss Elizabeth's straightforward character," Eric said politely, and the three of them walked to the villa where the party was held. About 20 guests had already arrived at the villa, and as time went by, more people came one after another. In addition to the cast and crew of Friends, Fox had invited a lot of Hollywood stars to come and support the party. Although Murdoch had been anxious because of Eric these days, it was impossible for him to talk to Eric as soon as he arrived. Therefore, after chatting with Eric in the villa and telling him to enjoy the party, Murdoch and Barry Diller went to entertain the other guests as if nothing had happened. Eric took the time to look around the crowd, and soon found the figure of Jennifer Aniston. At the same time, he couldn't help but gasp. That girl Elizabeth is definitely doing this on purpose. Look at the girls who seem to be chatting and laughing together. Julia Robert, Brooke Shields, Gabrielle, and even Nicole Kidman have appeared. Taking a closer look, oh my God, there's still Drew. Shouldn't that little girl be in boarding school? Seeing this situation, Eric quickly turned around and planned to stay far away, but Nicole, who happened to be facing him, caught him. A moment later, a girl in a black pencil skirt and high heels appeared next to Eric, who was hiding in the crowd. "Good evening, Eric." The girl leaned closer to Eric, less than 30 centimeters away from Eric, and gently raised the red wine in her hand. It was said that the intimate distance between people was within 45 centimeters, and more than 45 centimeters, they were at most friends. The girl definitely didn't know this theory, and the reason why she was so close to Eric was probably completely self-taught. Sure enough, the girl's action made several people around her involuntarily look at her and Eric. Of course, Eric didn't know about the theory of 45 centimeters, but he instinctively felt uncomfortable. He subconsciously took a small step back and asked, "Nicole, why are you here?" Nicole noticed Eric's move and showed a slightly bitter expression, but she didn't dare to move forward again. She explained, "I'm also Australian." Eric quickly dug out some memories of the Australian gang in Hollywood from his memory. It was said that the Australian gang was the most united small circle in Hollywood. However, it was still the end of the 1980s, and the Australian gang definitely didn't exist yet. Representatives of the Australian gang like Hugh Jackman, Russell Crowe, Cate Blanchett, and Nicole were still unknown. Therefore, he was sure that Nicole's appearance here had nothing to do with her being Australian like the Murdochs. Although the girl didn't tell the truth, Eric could still guess some of it. He thought about how Gabriel could make a name for himself in Hollywood with those groundless rumors about him, and how she could get the role of the second female lead in a movie as a newcomer. Then, with Nicole's identity as the female lead in his next movie, coupled with her schemes and methods that were far superior to Gabriel's, although she didn't have a single film in Hollywood, she would definitely have a good life. After figuring this out, Eric didn't want to delve further. He didn't care how Nicole played tricks, as long as she was sensible in front of him. "Nicole, what were you talking about just now?" Eric pointed to the place where the girls were gathered. The girl chuckled, and there was an appropriate but not excessive teasing expression on her face. "Don't worry, Eric. No one was talking about Miss Jennifer Aniston's dress. We were talking about, Friends. That's the theme tonight. And you, the second daughter of the Murdochs, is quite interested in you." After saying the last sentence, Nicole winked mischievously. Eric couldn't help but take a sip of red wine to hide the embarrassment on his face, and then asked, "Anything else?" "No." Nicole shook her head, and then said softly with a teasing tone, "But you definitely won't be able to go to someone's place tonight. Eric, why don't you come to my place? You're really up to no good." Eric narrowed his eyes and glanced at the girl. Jennifer Aniston usually had the attitude of an ostrich when it came to the rumors about him being a playboy. Tonight, with so many women who had close relationships with him appearing in front of her, Jennifer Aniston must be very upset. If he dared to leave her at this time and spend the night with other women, he would be waiting for a storm. "Seriously, am I that kind of bad woman in your heart?" Nicole glared at Eric with dissatisfaction. If he hadn't caught the girl's slightly flickering eyes, Eric would have thought that she had said those words unintentionally. "Do me a favor, Nicole," Eric said after thinking for a while. Seeing the girl's interested expression, Eric continued, "Help me keep an eye on Jenny. She's a simple-minded girl. I'm sure you can make her happy easily." Nicole suddenly opened her eyes wide and protested. "I don't want to." Eric glanced at the girl and said in a serious tone, "Don't refuse. Also look after Drew. Don't let the two of them fight." Every time he thought of the two girls fighting, Eric felt a lingering fear. When the two girls fought, there was a certain degree of atavism. In layman's terms, they liked to use their little claws to scratch people. If they scratched people's faces, it would be terrible. Nicole had stayed in Eric's villa for a long time, so she was very clear about Drew's temperament. That little girl's mind was not much worse than hers. If she really fought with Jennifer Aniston, that one-track-minded girl, how could she stop it? Thinking of this, the girl shook her head again. With a bitter face and a faint pleading tone, she said, "This is too difficult, Eric." Eric nonchalantly took a sip of red wine and said in a flat but unquestionable tone, "Go quickly. If the two of them fight tonight, you don't have to act in Sleepless in Seattle." Nicole could tell that Eric wasn't joking. She lamented in her heart, "Who did I offend?" However, she didn't dare to dawdle. She turned around and left quickly in her leather shoes. Chapter 212. "Mr. Williams, you're really rude," Elizabeth said to Eric as soon as Nicole left. Eric turned around and stared at Elizabeth's delicate face. He shrugged and said, "This is just a small punishment for a woman who likes to play tricks. So Liz, this story tells us that it's better to be honest. You've been speaking to me in such a distant tone since we met today. It really makes me sad. Have you forgotten the good times we spent together in Venice?" Elizabeth's face was slightly hot as if she had thought of something. She let out a fake laugh and said provocatively, Are you going to punish me for this too, Mr. Williams?" Eric touched his chin and pondered. He then said, "Maybe I can raise the licensing conditions of Friends and tell Mr. Murdoch that this is a punishment for Miss Elizabeth's indifference to me." Elizabeth suddenly looked angry. Her beautiful eyes stared at Eric. She remembered that her father had just told her that if she insisted on doing things her own way, he would block her credit card. The girl stomped her feet angrily. If Eric really said that, it would not be as simple as blocking her credit card. The more she thought about it, the more aggrieved and angry she became. Finally, she gritted her teeth and said, "Eric Williams, you're really a bastard." Eric was of course just joking this time, but he did not expect the girl to have such a big reaction. A trace of tears appeared in the corners of her eyes because of excitement, so he quickly explained, "Liz, don't be angry. I was just joking." The girl looked like she wanted to turn around and leave, but her feet seemed to be glued to the ground. However, her expression did not soften much because of Eric's explanation. She said coldly, "Mr. Williams, my father asked me to come over and invite you to talk. I wonder if you have time?" "Of course you can. You take me there?" Elizabeth nodded slightly, turned around and walked to the stairs first. Eric quickly followed. Arriving at a room on the second floor, Elizabeth knocked on the door. Without waiting for a response, she pushed the door open and gestured for Eric to enter. After entering, Eric scanned the room. It was a simple reception room with a row of bookshelves, a few sofas, and a coffee table in the middle. Old Murdoch was the only one in the room. Even Barry Diller wasn't there. "Eric, come sit down." Seeing Eric come in, Murdoch quickly stood up and smiled as he motioned for Eric to sit down on the opposite sofa. He then ordered, "Liz, make a cup of coffee for Eric." The girl nodded at Murdoch and walked to the side with an indifferent expression. Eric saw Murdoch looking at his daughter's back with a smile, so he also looked over. Elizabeth's red one-shoulder dress perfectly accentuated her slim figure. "Eric, you're 19 years old this year, right?" Murdoch asked inexplicably. Eric nodded. His body's birthday was on the 16th of May on the Gregorian calendar. Speaking of which, his 19th birthday happened to be during the intense filming of Dark War. So he didn't even have a party. He just had a meal with a few people close to him. Liz is actually only 2 years older than you. I still remember what she looked like when she was a child. Unfortunately, I've been too busy and haven't had much opportunity to get close to my children. It seems that in the blink of an eye, that somewhat introverted little thing has grown up into a big girl. Unfortunately, her personality is still like that of a child. Dad, how am I like a child? Elizabeth finally turned her head in dissatisfaction and handed 2 cups of coffee to Eric and Murdoch respectively. She then sat down next to Murdoch. She wanted to leave, but unfortunately, Murdoch had sternly warned her before. Although Elizabeth sometimes liked to go against her father, when Murdoch was really angry, she didn't dare to disobey. Murdoch laughed a few times and said to Eric, "See, you're so impulsive, but you still say you're not like a child." Eric laughed dryly. The old man's intentions were becoming more and more obvious. Eric had no intention of marrying a princess at all. Otherwise, how could he live a good life? Unexpectedly, after Murdoch finished speaking, he changed the topic. Eric is sleepless in Seattle, about to start shooting? This is a good topic. Eric sighed in his heart and quickly replied, "Yes, the shooting will take no more than a week at the latest. It's already September. I have to finish Sleepless in Seattle and Home Alone together. Time is very tight. Maybe the shooting and post-production will be carried out at the same time." Murdoch said leisurely with a faint fascination, "I have some understanding of film production, but it's rare to see someone make a film as fast as you, so I'm very curious about how you make a film." Although he was cheating, Eric was still very happy with this implied compliment. He said readily, "Haha, if possible, Mr. Murdoch is welcome to visit the crew." "Of course not." Murdoch looked regretful. "I'm also very busy. But Eric, what do you think of Liz?" Eric looked puzzled. Why did the topic change to Elizabeth again? Murdoch said unhurriedly, "It's like this. Liz University's courses have all been completed, and she just needs an internship. You must know the major of Liz University. Then, how about letting her be your assistant in the Sleepless in Seattle crew? It's also good for her to train with an outstanding young man like you." Eric suddenly had the urge to curse. It turned out that this was the trap waiting for him. He looked at Elizabeth next to Murdoch. The little girl lowered her head and gently fiddled with her fingers, looking like a good daughter who would let her father make the decision. "Mr. Murdoch, the crew has to run around New York, Seattle, and Chicago. Being my director's assistant must be tedious and boring. Elizabeth definitely can't stand it." Elizabeth, who was originally reluctant, immediately raised her head and glared at Eric. She didn't know if it was because of her competitiveness, but when she heard Eric's words, she immediately retorted, "Why can't I stand it? Do you look down on women?" Old Murdoch looked at Eric, who was rendered speechless by his daughter's words, and immediately laughed. "Ha ha ha, that's what I said, Eric. It's settled then." "What did you say?" Eric immediately wanted to refute again, but Murdoch didn't give Eric a chance to refuse. He patted his daughter on the shoulder and said, "Liz, you go out. I have something to talk to Eric alone." Elizabeth nodded and glared at Eric, then turned and left. Chapter 213. After Elizabeth closed the door, Murdoch slowly picked up the coffee pot and poured himself a cup of coffee. Then he made a casual gesture to Eric. Eric shook his head gently. "It's not a good habit to drink too much coffee at night." Murdoch smiled. "It's fine for you young people, but when you reach my age, you have to drink more coffee to stay awake. If you want to maintain your energy, there are actually more healthy ways to do so." Murdoch didn't continue this topic and said, "Eric, speaking of which, your first movie was with Fox. The cooperation between us has always been very pleasant, hasn't it?" Of course, even I didn't expect that the box office of Back to 17 would exceed 100 million yuan. Eric shrugged and replied. At the same time, he hinted that it was useless for Murdoch to play the emotional card with him. He did rely on the opportunity given by Fox to participate in Back to 17 to enter Hollywood. But he didn't know Fox anything. Back to 17-inch not only brought tens of millions of dollars in box office profits for Fox, but the income from the follow-up videos and TV broadcast rights would definitely exceed $100 million. And he only received less than $1 million from it. Speaking of which, Fox was really stingy. After Back to 17 stopped airing, he didn't even get a red packet from the box office. Eric felt that this matter might have something to do with Fox missing out on Home in Town. Although it was Fox who refused to release Home in Town, after the box office of Home in Town, Fox would definitely vent their anger on him. It was still the same principle. When a person made an unbearable mistake, they would always subconsciously vent their anger on others and refuse to reflect on themselves. Murdoch was just about to get close to Eric when he was directly rebuked. Even though he was used to seeing the world, there was a flash of embarrassment on his face. "Eric, I heard that other TV stations have been in contact with you?" The contact between the representatives of the three major TV stations and Eric was all in the newspapers. Even the famous Los Angeles Times and New York Times did related analysis articles. Most of the newspapers were pessimistic about whether Fox could keep the broadcast rights of Friends for the next season. Yes, their conditions are very tempting. Murdoch picked up the cup of coffee in front of him and took a sip. He also realized that the young man in front of him was not easy to deal with at all. If he continued to talk to the young man in front of him, the young man would definitely talk to him until the end. Putting down the coffee cup, Murdoch decided to get straight to the point. "Eric, how about this? Fox will increase the advertising share for Firefly to 70% in exchange for the broadcast rights of Friends for the next 4 seasons. As long as they could get the broadcast rights of Friends for the first 5 seasons, Murdoch believed that with the influence of this hit movie, after 5 years of development, Fox would definitely be able to establish a firm foothold in North America. Then, after 5 seasons, Fox would have the confidence to renegotiate with Firefly's share of Friends based on the ratings. Eric raised his head and stared at Murdoch. "Mr. Murdoch, is this Fox's sincerity? Isn't this enough to show Fox's sincerity?" Murdoch asked rhetorically. Eric immediately shook his head. Under normal circumstances, this percentage was indeed very sincere. The TV industry was different from the film industry. Because TV stations were not bound by the relevant anti-monopoly laws, they could produce their own TV programs and be self-sufficient. Therefore, TV stations were very strong when it came to independent production of American TV series. Under normal circumstances, TV stations would buy out the broadcasting rights from the producers. Even if Warner Brothers and other film giants could enjoy a share of the advertising revenue, the highest share would not exceed 40%. Under normal circumstances, it would only be around 30%. But this time, the situation was completely different. For Fox, which was now in its infancy, the high ratings brought by Friends were only a foundation. The most important thing was that Friends could help Fox quickly increase its popularity and cultivate its audience. Mr. Murdoch, before Friends, Fox's average viewership was only a few million, less than 1/10 of the fixed TV audience in North America. For the time being, Friends can bring more than 20 million viewers to Fox. Even after this season, it can at least increase the average viewership of Fox to more than 10 million viewers. Compared to this, your offer just now seems too insincere. Murdoch stared at Eric and said word by word, "Eric, you should know that the price I just offered is almost twice what other producers can get." Under the gaze of the media mogul in front of him, Eric did not show any fear. Instead, he smiled softly and said, "Mr. Murdoch, I believe you must have done some research, so you should know that in order to get Friends, the price offered by the 3 major TV stations is not much lower than yours. Someone has also calculated that if I broadcast Friends on several established TV stations, the advertising revenue will increase by more than 10%. With this 10% compensation, it is actually almost the same price as Fox. Compared to Fox, if I choose to cooperate with other established TV stations, the benefits will definitely be more." After Eric finished speaking, he lowered his head slightly again and picked up the coffee in front of him. He did not look at Murdoch's expression. He believed that the so-called 70% advertising share was just a test by Murdoch. Feeling the delicate white porcelain in his hand, Eric quickly noticed that there was a light green plant painted on the ceramic coffee cup, which was quite like an ink painting. Seeing this, Eric suddenly had the urge to turn the cup upside down, wanting to see if the words, "Made in China," were engraved on the bottom. However, Eric soon smiled because of this idea. This sudden smile made Murdoch feel very inexplicable, but the expression on his face also relaxed with Eric's smile. "Eric, let's talk about your conditions. What does Fox have to do to get the rights to the sequel of Friends?" Chapter 214. Eric gently put down the coffee cup in his hand, looked up and said, "Mr. Murdoch, you must know something about me. I'm a very stubborn person. If you let me speak, then I won't give in at all. If Fox can't accept it, then the two sides will definitely be very unhappy. So you say it first. If Fox's conditions can satisfy me, I'm not a greedy person." Murdoch secretly scolded Little Rascal in his heart. This was not greedy. But Murdoch only thought for a moment and said, "Eric, the cooperation between Fox and Firefly has always been very pleasant, so how about this? I'll exchange 5% of Fox's shares for the same proportion of Firefly's shares. Presumably, you also know the market value of Fox. Firefly has a big advantage. This can also make the cooperation between the two film companies closer. I'll use this price in exchange for the broadcast rights of Friends for the next 4 seasons. The 70% advertising share that I just proposed remains unchanged. What do you think this time?" When Eric heard Murdoch's offer, he was slightly tempted. After a few seconds, he didn't feel like he was taking advantage of Murdoch at all. He heard very clearly that what Murdoch said was to exchange Fox's shares for Firefly's shares, not Fox's shares. Perhaps the public would think that the two companies were one, but Eric was very clear about the difference. Although they were currently under the control of Barry Diller, Fox's film company and Fox's television network were two completely unrelated companies. Fox's current market value was about $2 billion. 5% of the shares were worth $100 million, and 5% of Firefly's shares were really not worth that much now. According to the price at the time of the merger with New Line, Firefly's market value was only about $600 million. In this way, as long as Firefly agreed to exchange shares with Fox, it was equivalent to making $70 million. But things were far from that simple. After the merger of Firefly and New Line Cinema, all the movie giants in Hollywood knew of Firefly's potential. If Eric's movies continued to reap box office profits, perhaps within a few years, Firefly's position would be on par with the 7 major movie companies. Correspondingly, Firefly's market value would also skyrocket, and it might even surpass Fox. Eric was very confident that if everything went smoothly, this process would not even take 5 years. Some time ago, Eric paid 15% of Firefly's shares, and a large sum of money to acquire the New Line. This was because it would make up for Firefly's lack of distribution ability and greatly shorten the pace of Firefly's rise. 5% of the shares was enough to give him a say in the board of directors. After exchanging shares with Fox, not only would Eric not see many benefits, but he would also be restricted. Furthermore, the corners of Eric's mouth twitched slightly. He leaned forward slightly and asked Murdoch, "Mr. Murdoch, how much do you think Fox Studios will make this year?" Murdoch's heart skipped a beat. Could it be that this little guy had seen through him? However, Murdoch still had a glimmer of hope. He shook his head and said, "I'm not too sure about this. I'll only know after the year-end financial report comes out." Eric almost sneered. "Mr. Murdoch, I can do a little calculation for Fox. Because Mr. Barry Diller focuses on the development of Fox television network, Fox itself doesn't have many movies to launch, and there isn't a single big-budget movie with high box office potential. This year, Fox is focusing on 3 of my movies, Pretty Woman, Sleepless in Seattle, and Kids in Charge 2. Wind and Moon has already been settled. It's $210 million in North America and $530 million worldwide. Fox can get at least $70 million in profit after deducting the distribution fee. Moreover, I personally think that Fox can get at least $100 million in profit from the next 2 movies, Sleepless in Seattle and kids in charge too. Plus the peripheral income from other movies and videotapes released by Fox. It's really a good year. Maybe we can make an annual profit of $300 million this year. It's almost twice the normal year. When Murdoch heard Eric's summary, he couldn't help but feel happy. If this was the case, this result would definitely rank first among the 7 major film companies. Even Warner, which made a lot of money this year because of Batman, might not be able to make such a high annual profit. After the year-end financial report came out, Fox's market value would definitely usher in a big rise. However, after the surprise, some of the luck in Murdoch's heart was completely shattered. He just asked dryly, "Eric, isn't this very good?" "Of course it's very good," Eric said. "Then let's calculate Firefly's profit this year." As Eric spoke, he raised a few fingers and counted one by one. Pretty Woman, $105 million. Dark War, according to the current box office trend, the global box office can still reach about $500 million. Firefly can get another $100 million. Sleepless in Seattle, and Kids in Charge too at the end of the year, after deducting the cost, Firefly can at least get $100 million like Fox. Don't forget, I still have 3 other movies released at the end of the year. I'm very optimistic about all 3 movies, but even if the 3 movies are combined, they can only get $100 million. When the money is distributed at the end of the year, Fox can get $20 million in dividends, while Firefly can only get $15 million. Speaking of this, Eric retracted his arm in front of him, but his heart was extremely angry. Originally, when Murdoch proposed the conditions, Eric was tempted for a moment because of the $70 million difference in stock value. But after sorting out the situation, he found that this was another big hole dug by the old guy opposite him. The exchange of shares and Fox's acquisition of the first 5 seasons of Friends were 2 different things. Murdoch cleverly mixed the 2 things together and gave Eric the illusion that Fox was very sincere. But if Eric really chose the 5% shares, he might not get any benefits in the end. Instead, he would have to pay Fox a dividend every year because of the profit gap. In addition, the shares would definitely have a long limited sale period. When it could be sold, perhaps Firefly's market value would be almost the same as Fox's. Fox would definitely have the right to take back the shares first. Even if Eric sold the shares back to the other party, the final result would be that Fox owned Firefly's shares and could interfere with Firefly's affairs, but Firefly couldn't interfere with Fox's affairs. Another point was that after the share exchange, the interests of Firefly and Fox would be tied together. Even if he was unwilling, if necessary, Eric had to pinch his nose and choose to cooperate with Fox first. This was probably the main reason why Murdoch wanted to exchange shares with Firefly. If Eric's body was still a little naive, a little cowardly, and a little impulsive, maybe when he figured this out, he would definitely be so angry that he would burst into tears and shout, "This is too much, I won't cooperate with you anymore." To be honest, Eric might have had this kind of impulse just now because of the remnant thoughts of the original owner. However, the soul of a middle-aged man in his 40s was still dominant in this body. In addition, because of the special experience of being reborn, Eric was already relatively indifferent to many things. It was even more impossible for him to get angry for money. Of course, Eric was still very angry at this time. "Mr. Murdoch, maybe Fox doesn't want to show any sincerity at all then," Murdoch smiled faintly and said. "Eric, listen to me, why don't we?" "No," Eric immediately interrupted Murdoch. He wasn't sure if the old man's next condition would be a trap waiting for him. If he didn't react in time, he would be in trouble. "Let me say it. I'm not very interested in Fox's shares, but since we're discussing Friends today, let's talk about the Fox network. I want shares in Fox. If Fox wants to get the broadcast rights for the next few seasons of Friends, they must transfer 10% of the shares to me at 80% of the market value of Fox before Friends started." Murdoch was shocked by Eric's exorbitant demand. Although he was known as a media tycoon, he only owned a little more than 30% of News Corporation's shares, and News Corporation only owned about 80% of Fox's shares. In total, his family only owned 24% of Fox's shares. If he agreed to Eric's conditions, Then Firefly would become the second largest shareholder of Fox, second only to the Murdoch family. If there was a conflict between the two sides in the future, as long as Eric obtained the support of other shareholders, it was very likely that he would seize the dominance of Fox. Fox was Murdoch's most important move to enter the North American market. In any case, he couldn't agree to Eric's conditions. To be honest, Eric didn't have such a big appetite. His original plan was only to get about 5% of Fox's shares. From the information collected, Fox's current value was less than $1 billion, far less than the $4 to $5 billion of the three major TV stations. However, Eric knew that in more than a decade, Fox's scale would be on par with the three major TV stations, reaching more than $30 billion. Now he only needed to invest less than $50 million. By then, the 5% of shares would be worth more than $1.5 billion. Moreover, compared to film companies, the profits of television networks were more stable. In the future, he could get a large dividend from Fox's billions of US dollars of annual profits without doing anything. Chapter 215. Eric, you should know that 10% of the shares is impossible. Even if I agree, the board of directors won't agree, Murdoch said in a deep voice. Eric, you should know that 10% of the shares is impossible. Even if I agree, the board won't agree. Eric didn't seem to feel the pressure from Murdoch's expression and said casually, Mr. Murdoch, although you don't have absolute control, the whole world knows that News Corporation belongs to Rupert Murdoch. I believe you must have the power to decide this matter, so don't use the board of directors as an excuse to fool me, okay? Then I'll tell you clearly, Eric, there's no room for negotiation. You'd better change your condition. Eric still looked relaxed and even crossed his legs, but his tone became powerful. Mr. Murdoch, I've said before that I'm a very stubborn person. Once I open my mouth, I won't change it. After this sentence, the scene in the reception room suddenly quieted down. The old man and the young man stared at each other, but after a moment, Eric took the lead to look away. It was not that he was guilty, but he felt that it was really meaningless to do so. What was the use of suppressing others? The key to negotiation was to see who had more chips. And now the most important chip was in Eric's hands. After drinking the remaining coffee in the cup, Eric was finally able to turn the ceramic cup over. There was no doubt that the words were not engraved on the bottom. After putting the cup back on the table, Eric looked up at Murdoch. Eric, why don't we stop here today? Maybe we should all calm down. As soon as Murdoch opened his mouth, Eric was acutely aware that he had unknowingly gained the upper hand in this confrontation. Under such circumstances, how could he not do it in one go? Mr. Murdoch, my schedule is very tight. If I miss today, I don't know if I can find time in the next 2 months. Also, the three major TV stations are still waiting for my answer. After Eric finished speaking, he seemed to feel that it was not enough, so he added, Oh, by the way, ABC has been losing a lot in recent years, and their offer is also the highest. Also, they had previously mentioned that they were willing to pay a penalty fee to buy the remaining episodes of this season of Friends. To be honest, I'm quite tempted. After all, for the first season of Friends, I can only get a 40% advertising share from Fox. But if it's another company, ABC's offer is, sorry, this is a trade secret. This was a blatant threat. Murdoch almost wanted to throw the things in front of him at Eric's face. Of course, he could only think about it. Murdoch said coldly, If you want to breach the contract, then wait to see me in federal court. I guarantee that you won't get a single cent until the end. Mr. Murdoch, do you think News Corporation can compete with the three major TV stations and the forces behind them in North America? You know very well in your heart that if this lawsuit really goes to war, Fox will definitely lose. Maybe after the lawsuit is over, Friends will have to wait until next year to air again. Maybe Firefly will also lose a lot, but there is no doubt that Fox will lose more. Without Friends, it's even more wishful thinking for Fox to rise up in a short period of time. During this period of time, the three major television stations have already realized the threat and joined forces to kick Fox out. If we really do that, Firefly won't get any benefits. Eric, don't forget, in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and the US, these major English-speaking countries, News Corporation has a strong ability to control media public opinion with the newspapers and TV stations in their hands. Even the UK government has to carefully maintain a good relationship with News Corporation to maintain their media image. If you do that, I can ruin the reputation of Firefly's movie in the world, and ruin your image in the world. Do you know how many reports about you and those actresses have been suppressed by the New York Post? I personally intervened in a few of them. A reporter from the New York Post began to be interested in you 6 months ago, and followed you for 2 months. He took photos of all your private life. The New York Post originally wanted to do a report about all your deeds, about the actress named Virginia Madsen, about your current girlfriend, about Julia Roberts. Oh, I almost forgot about Miss Drew Barrymore. She is only 14 years old now, isn't she? After Murdoch said these words, he proudly picked up the coffee in front of him and wanted to take a sip, but Eric, who had been slightly lowering his head, raised his head at this time. Murdoch found that Eric's eyes were cold and his slightly pale face had an abnormal blush. Oh no! Murdoch exclaimed in his heart. He suddenly realized that Eric was only 19 years old, and he was a young man who had achieved success at a young age. The combination of these two situations meant that Eric was more likely to be impulsive than other young people when faced with threats. If this young man was impulsive and would rather break the contract to take away friends, then even if he really used the power of the media to destroy this young man's public image, News Corporation would not benefit at all. This was obviously not in the interests of News Corporation. Eric did not seem to notice the change in Murdoch's expression. He raised his wrist and looked at his watch, then raised his head to look at Murdoch. Mr. Murdoch, you have 1 minute to think about it. Agree to my conditions or break up. We will each do our own things and see who loses more in the end. The countdown starts now. After that, Eric lowered his head again. Murdoch suddenly panicked. It seemed that this young man had lost his mind. Eric, don't be like this, okay? You are already an adult, Murdoch said helplessly with a slight reproach in his tone. Eric did not seem to hear Murdoch's words. He lowered his head and counted to himself. 55. 54. 53. Seeing that Eric ignored him, Murdoch leaned back on the sofa and narrowed his eyes slightly, as if he wanted to see if Eric dared to count to the end. He had read Eric's information before and knew that this young man was far more mature and steady than his peers. He was betting that perhaps Eric would be impulsive because of what he had just said, but a 1-minute countdown was enough for this smart young man to calm down. 36. 35. 34. The countdown continued relentlessly. Chapter 216. Usually, a minute passed in a blink of an eye, but for Murdoch, it felt like a long time. Murdoch originally hoped that the young man in front of him could calm down, but soon, as Eric said the numbers one by one, Murdoch couldn't calm down. He began to quickly calculate the gains and losses of the matter. Eric was right. Once Fox lost friends this time, they would miss the best and possibly only opportunity to rise. Once Fox lost friends, it wouldn't be a big deal if they could just lay low and quietly develop. But after the ratings miracle of Friends, the 3 established television stations all realized that Fox was a threat to their status, and they would certainly not allow Fox to develop steadily without Friends. Having been in the media industry for decades, Murdoch was used to seeing all kinds of intrigue and cruel competition in the industry. When he left Australia and went to the UK to develop his career, during the most difficult period, his competitors retaliated against him, an outsider, by hook or by crook. Even the personal safety of his family was threatened. A group of kidnappers once mistakenly kidnapped the wife of a News Corporation manager as his wife. When they learned that they had kidnapped the wrong person, the poor woman was killed. Now that he was in the United States, Murdoch believed that the competition in the North American industry would not be much gentler than in the United Kingdom. In less than 30 seconds, countless thoughts had passed through Murdoch's mind. Eric, who was sitting across from him, was still staring at the watch in his hand as he counted down unhurriedly. 9, 8, 7, 6. In the last few seconds, Murdoch finally sighed and waved his hand gently. Eric, stop counting, I promise you. Eric heard Murdoch's words and paused for a moment. Then, as if by some kind of inertia, he slowly finished counting the remaining numbers and raised his head. Of course, it was impossible for him to suddenly act like a young man. As a mature middle-aged man, although Murdoch's threat to him was much more despicable than his threat to take away friends, it was impossible for him to do anything extreme because of it. He was betting that there was more than a 70% chance that Murdoch would agree, because Fox needed friends too much. Of course, he also thought about the consequences if Murdoch really didn't agree. In fact, it didn't matter if the negotiations really broke down. He was sure that when the countdown ended, he would leave. Murdoch would definitely come looking for them again, because according to the original plan, it was impossible for him to really cut off the cooperation with Fox. After Fox expressed goodwill several times, he would agree to renegotiate with them after some reluctance. But if that happened, Fox would definitely realize his bottom line from his actions. At that time, he would no longer have a chance to get 10% of Fox's shares. However, Eric's eyes after he put forward the conditions, Murdoch's attitude, Eric's of the eye, made him think that he would have no chance of getting 10% of Fox's shares. However, when Murdoch heard that Liu Zhou might transfer friends to ABC, he used his women to threaten Liu Zhou, which gave Liu Zhou a reason to attack. Wasn't it reasonable for a young and impetuous man like him to fly into a rage for a beauty? Since the chances of getting 10% of the shares were slim to begin with, Eric decided to take a gamble. In the end, Murdoch didn't dare to take this risk. He was afraid that Eric would leave without giving him a chance to negotiate. He would directly cut off the cooperation with Fox and transfer friends to ABC. Once the worst happened, there would be no room for redemption. Therefore, he won the gamble. Although Murdoch nodded, Eric didn't show any joy. He just picked up the coffee pot in front of him and poured himself a cup of coffee. He picked it up and tasted it carefully, waiting for Murdoch to speak first. Murdoch's eyes were shrewd and ruthless. From Eric's indifferent actions, he quickly realized that he might have been fooled just now. Regret. This was the first thought that came to Murdoch's mind. However, if Eric was still pretending to be angry to threaten him, then if he immediately went back on his word, then Eric might really leave in a huff. After fighting in the media industry for more than 30 years, how could Murdoch be willing to lose to a kid? Since he couldn't immediately turn his back on him, of course, Murdoch had to try his best to recover the loss. Eric, I can give you 10% of Fox's shares, but you should also know that if you use this TV series to negotiate the same conditions with the 3 major TV stations, they may kick you out of the office. So one friends is far from enough. You need Murdoch pondered for a moment and then said, you need to provide 2 excellent TV series for Fox. Of course, I know it's difficult to reach the level of Friends. So as long as the average viewership of the 2 TV series can reach 1,500 viewers, I promise to transfer the shares to you. When Eric heard this condition, he almost laughed out loud. If Murdoch had put forward other conditions, it might have been difficult for him. But if it was a US TV series with high ratings, not to mention 2, even 20 TV series, Eric would be able to recall them from the corner of his memory. In his previous life, American TV series with terrible viewership ratings were even too lazy to translate the subtitles. Therefore, most of the TV series that could enter the country were high viewership and high quality. However, Eric also heard some other problems from Murdoch's words. Murdoch clearly just said that he would transfer the shares to him only after he provided 2 high viewership American TV series for Fox. How could that be possible? He was sure that if he really gave the 3 TV series to Fox first, when the results were out, Murdoch would not give him any shares even if he had to sacrifice his old face. Because by that time, the 3 TV series would have finished airing, and Fox would have cultivated a sufficient fixed audience with its high viewership ratings. The next step was very clear. Get rid of the donkey after it had outlived its usefulness. Mr. Murdoch, I can provide 2 more TV series for Fox, and it won't be a problem for the ratings to exceed 15 million, because I just happen to have a few good ideas. But I don't like to play word games. Today is the 8th, and Friends will air again on the 10th. If Fox doesn't show their sincerity to transfer the shares by the night after tomorrow, I can't guarantee what will happen. After Eric finished speaking, he pretended to get up. If Eric had only said the last few words, perhaps Murdoch would have let Eric leave. But when he heard Eric say that he just happened to have a few good ideas, Murdoch was tempted again. He proposed the so-called 2 TV series with more than 15 million viewership ratings, because he wanted to break the promise just now. With an average viewership of more than 15 million viewers, there were no more than 10 TV series in North America every year. Most of them were the sequels of old popular TV series. It was even more difficult for a brand new American TV series to achieve this result. Therefore, the first season of Friends had a viewership of more than 30 million viewers, which was why it caused such a huge sensation. Therefore, when he saw that Eric was about to get up, Murdoch quickly waved his hand to stop him. "Wait, Eric, how can I play word games with you? You have to believe that since I've agreed to your conditions, I definitely won't go back on my word. So, can we sit down and have a good talk? Tell me about your ideas?" "Like hell I'd believe you." Eric cursed silently. He didn't want to talk anymore. It was too tiring to confront Murdoch, this old fox. If he wasn't careful, he might fall into his trap. But when he heard Murdoch's question, Eric couldn't help but sit down again. "Actually, this is what I think, Mr. Murdoch. I can give you 2 TV series, but if you want to increase the influence of a TV station, a TV series alone is definitely not enough. In addition to giving Fox a TV series different from Friends, I plan to create a variety show for Fox. I guarantee that if this variety show is done well, it won't be a problem for the average viewership to exceed 20 million. Murdoch's heart skipped a beat and he asked, "Eric, can you talk about your variety show idea?" Eric smiled and shook his head. "Mr. Murdoch, I just said that I hope to see the preliminary equity transfer plan of Fox before the 10th. Before that, there's no need to talk about anything." "But you're not willing to reveal anything. How do I know if you're telling the truth?" Murdoch asked. Eric rubbed his palms in annoyance and reminded him, "Mr. Murdoch, don't forget that you promised to transfer the shares of Fox to me because of Friends. It has nothing to do with the other 2 TV shows, so you can only choose to believe me. How about this, Eric? I can transfer the shares to you first, but you have to specify that it will be for a year. Within a year, if you can't fulfill the promise of more than 15 million average viewership for the 2 TV shows, then 5% of the shares will be returned to you for one less show. What do you think?" Eric sneered. "Mr. Murdoch, it's 100 times easier to fake viewership ratings than to fake the box office. When the time comes, Fox will get whatever you want. Do you think I'll agree?" Chapter 217. Murdoch smiled sincerely and said, "Eric, everyone knows that the ratings are calculated by Nielsen. Nielsen is a commercial market research company. It exists to make money, doesn't it?" Eric asked bluntly. Since it was a commercial company, as long as there were enough benefits, it was easy to tamper with the data. Especially in this era, the statistics of TV program ratings were still relatively backward, and there was more room for manipulation of the ratings data. "Mr. Murdoch, since you have just agreed to my conditions, why don't you be more straightforward? This way, we can cooperate more happily in the future." Murdoch cursed inwardly. This matter might even affect the future dominance of the Fox network. How could he be happy about it? If it weren't for Eric's coercion just now, Murdoch wouldn't have agreed in any case. But now, he knew that since he was at a disadvantage in the confrontation just now, and his subsequent little tricks were seen through and rejected by Eric one by one, and this kid was now pressing him step by step, then this time it was likely that he would have to give up the 10% shares. Because until now, he still didn't know Eric's bottom line in his heart. He wasn't sure whether Eric would take the risk of breaching the contract and transfer Friends to other TV stations. He also didn't know what specific conditions the other 3 TV stations had offered to Eric. But on the other hand, Eric had figured out his thoughts. From the moment he nodded, Eric already knew that even if he brought in a major shareholder, he would never allow Fox to lose Friends. This alone gave Eric an absolute advantage in this confrontation. Since it was irreversible, Murdoch of course had to fight for as many benefits as possible. After all, as a person whose desire for control was no less than Eric's, even if Eric's Firefly would become the second largest shareholder of Fox, he still regarded Fox as his own private territory. Thinking back to when Fox wanted to participate in the production of Friends, but was rejected, Murdoch realized that if the two TV shows mentioned by Eric could still achieve good ratings, then didn't it mean that the copyrights of Fox's main programs were all in the hands of Firefly? This was simply equivalent to Firefly holding the pulse of Fox TV. Coupled with the 10% shares obtained by Firefly, once there might be some irreconcilable conflicts between him and Eric in the future, then it was self-evident which side the shareholders would stand on in order to protect the ACE programs. After hesitating for a moment again, Murdoch slowly said, "Well, Eric, I agree. We'll talk about the specifics later. But regarding the two shows you mentioned, since Firefly is about to become a shareholder of Fox, I hope you can provide ideas for the two shows to be produced by Fox." Eric could hear that Murdoch really agreed this time, and he was secretly excited. Not to mention how many times the shares would appreciate in the future. Investing in Fox TV meant that his career had expanded into a whole new field. Of course, since Murdoch gave him such a positive answer, then he had to express his sincerity now. Murdoch's previous words were actually right. If he wanted 10% shares of Fox, One Friends was far from enough. Although he was a little reluctant, Eric still said, "Mr. Murdoch, it's impossible to give the show to Fox, but I can agree that these two shows can be jointly produced by Fox and Firefly, and the investment and copyright will be shared equally." Murdoch didn't expect Eric to be so generous as to give the two shows to Fox. His purpose was to intervene in the production and copyright. Eric's proposal was very much in line with his psychological expectations, so he didn't bargain anymore. In this short period of time, Eric had spent a lot of effort to deal with him, and Murdoch was also exhausted. In that case, let's have a pleasant cooperation. Although there was red wine in the cabinet next to him, Murdoch didn't have the energy to get it. He directly picked up the coffee in front of him and gestured to Eric. "Let's have a pleasant cooperation." Eric also picked up the coffee. The old man and the young man smiled faintly at the same time, like a pair of old friends. The quarrel, threats, and confrontation just now seemed to have never happened. They talked about some more things, and it had been nearly an hour since they came out of the reception room. The wind in the corridor blew gently, and Eric suddenly felt a chill. After taking a few deep breaths of fresh air with a slight smell of the sea, Eric turned to the stairs and returned to the party hall on the first floor. It was already past 9 o'clock in the evening, and the party was at its peak. Countless men and women shuttled back and forth, and the hall was filled with chatter, but it didn't seem noisy at all. Under the accompaniment of the band, pairs of men and women embraced and danced together on the dance floor. Eric was planning to find Jennifer Aniston, but Robert Shea and Jeffrey, who had been anxiously waiting at the stairs for an hour, pulled him aside. "Eric, how did it go?" Robert asked first. Although there was a big gap between his shares and Eric's, he was already the second largest shareholder of Firefly, so the matter of Friends was also closely related to his interests. On the other hand, although Jeffrey was also very concerned about this matter, he wasn't as anxious as Robert. Eric had a slightly serious expression on his face as he said to Robert, "Robert, I have some bad news for you." "Oh." Robert Shea opened his mouth. Eric had already revealed some of his plans to them, so when he heard Eric say this, he couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. However, Robert still didn't give up and asked, "Could it be it didn't work out?" Eric shook his head and said to Robert and Jeffrey, "I'm saying, Robert, the box office share of Pretty Woman was supposed to be paid to you for the 60 million yuan, but now, this money might have to be used elsewhere." Robert and Jeffrey suddenly realized that Eric was just teasing them. It must have been a success. Pretending to be angry, Robert hammered Eric's chest and scolded jokingly, "Brat, stop beating around the bush and tell us the truth." Eric stretched out his right hand and spread out his 5 fingers in front of the two men. "Murdoch promised to give us 10% shares of Fox Television Network at 80% of the price before the broadcast of Friends." The two middle-aged men suddenly widened their eyes. Robert Shea gulped. He obviously hoped that Eric was telling the truth, but he instinctively felt that it was unbelievable. How could Robert Shea believe that a company ranked 4th in North America and had 10% shares of the TVB network, which had shown a rising trend because of Friends? Eric, this joke isn't funny at all. How many shares does the Murdoch family have? Jeffrey and Eric had known each other for a long time and had seen miracles happen to Eric more than once. Therefore, after a short moment of surprise, Jeffrey was more than 90% convinced. Eric, are you sure you're not joking? Eric took a glass of champagne from a waiter passing by and raised it to the two men. Of course, guys, we're about to become one of the major shareholders of Fox Television Network. This time Robert and Jeffrey did not have any doubts. Both of them looked surprised at the same time. Robert Shea excitedly raised his glass of red wine and drank it in one gulp. Although he only had 1.5% of the 10% shares, as the CEO of Firefly, it meant that he would have the right to speak in Fox Television Network. He had never thought about this before. After becoming a billionaire, Robert Shea was no longer so eager to pursue money. He now cared more about power. His goal was to become the head of an outstanding movie giant like Michael Eisner. Michael Eisner also did not have much of a stake in Disney, but he still had absolute power within Disney. Of course, there was one thing that Robert Shea did not realize, or deliberately ignored. That was Firefly still had Eric, but Disney did not have such a person. After a short moment of excitement, Eric continued the topic. So Robert, although Firefly can still pay you $60 million, this will definitely make Firefly's capital chain tight. So, I was wondering if we could wait until the end of the year to pay you the $60 million. Don't worry, I'll pay you interest according to the bank loan rate if it's beyond the payment deadline in the contract. Robert Shea laughed and patted Eric's shoulder. Of course, no problem. We're a family now. Why are you still talking about this? I've read the information. Firefly can't take out too much money at the end of the year. After all, the rest of Firefly's movies are released at the end of the year. By the time we get the share of those movies, it will be the middle of next year. So you can pay me when the time comes. After Robert Shea finished speaking, he immediately added as if nothing had happened. Actually, Eric, it's fine if you don't give me the money. You can just exchange it for Firefly's shares. Eric smiled and pretended not to notice Robert Shea's words. He changed the topic as if nothing had happened. After chatting for a while, Robert left with the red wine in satisfaction. Jeffrey, who had received Eric's hint, was a step slower and stayed. Chapter 218. After Robert Shea walked away, Eric said to Jeffrey, Jeffrey, as you can see, because of this, Firefly has an additional expenditure of nearly $80 million this year. The funds will be very tight. So how about you exchange all of your producers' share for this year into company shares at the end of the year? Jeffrey was stunned for a moment, then smiled and said, That's what I want. But Eric, do you plan to dilute Robert's shares so soon? Of course not. Eric smiled and said, If I do that, Robert will probably want to kill me. I will transfer some of my shares to you. I hope you don't mind it being too little. No, I'll take whatever you give me, Jeffrey said calmly. If I didn't want to see Firefly climb to the top step by step, I would have retired by now. By the way, I bought a farm in Maryland some time ago. It's about 2,000 acres. It happens to be the place where my wife grew up. Now I've handed it over to someone else to manage. When Firefly doesn't need me anymore, I'll take the initiative to leave. I'll go to that farm to plant corn, hunt, and enjoy my old age there. Eric felt a lump in his throat. If it weren't for the help of Jeffrey and the excellent team cultivated by his legendary wife, it was hard to say what kind of situation Eric would be in now. However, after Jeffrey finished speaking, Eric pretended to look like he couldn't stand it and said, Okay, Jeffrey, you're neither Juliet's Romeo nor the mermaid's prince. You're just a middle-aged bald fatty. Don't be so emotional, okay? Jeffrey knew that Eric wasn't really blaming him. This smart young man just didn't want to be immersed in the past. So he said humorously, Of course I'm not those people you're talking about. I'm Salina's Jeffrey. Wow, I'm going to throw up if you keep talking. Jeffrey smiled and shook his head. But Eric, if I really leave in the future, don't forget to come to the farm occasionally to visit me. You know, I don't have many relatives. Eric asked carefully. You haven't reconciled with your son yet? Upon hearing this question, Jeffrey was a little disappointed. I can't say that they're not on good terms, but they're not very harmonious. Chris is very busy, and we only see each other a few times a year, so it's not surprising that our relationship is a little distant. Eric was a little curious. Speaking of which, I've never seen your son before. You just said that his name is Chris. What does he do for a living? He works on Wall Street. Wall Street sounded more high-end than Hollywood. Eric couldn't help but think so in his heart. He asked again, which company on Wall Street? Morgan Stanley. Wow! Eric couldn't help but exclaim. Although he didn't pay much attention to this aspect, Eric also knew that Morgan Stanley was one of the 4 major investment banks, along with Merrill Lynch, Goldman Sachs, and Citigroup. In his memory, there were many famous financial storms behind these giants. I was thinking that if possible, I would let him work at Firefly. Since it's the famous Morgan Stanley, it's definitely out of the question. When Eric said this, Jeffrey couldn't help but show some pride. Even if the relationship between father and son was a little distant, no father wouldn't be proud of his son's excellence. Eric, if you want to make some investments in the future, you can try to find him. Although I don't know much about his specific work, Chris's professional qualities are definitely very good. When he was at the University of Pennsylvania, he always received a full scholarship. From beginning to end, he didn't let me pay a penny for tuition. When Eric heard Jeffrey's words, a lot of thoughts suddenly flashed through his mind. But he quickly suppressed these immature thoughts. He hadn't even seen Chris Hansen's face. Now, of course, he couldn't make a decision just because of Jeffrey's words. But in his heart, Eric quietly remembered Chris Hansen's matter. Eric and Jeffrey were chatting when Barry Diller came over. In addition to Robert and Jeffrey on Firefly's side, Barry Diller, who was at the helm of Fox Television Network, was also the one who paid the most attention to Friends. Barry Diller noticed Eric as soon as he came downstairs. However, he originally wanted to wait for Murdoch to come down and ask him the result of the matter directly. But for some reason, Eric had come down for a while, but Murdoch hadn't appeared again. Therefore, Barry Diller couldn't wait and had to come over. Mr. Hansen, Eric, hello. Barry Diller smiled and greeted Eric. After nodding to Barry Diller, Jeffrey knew that Barry Diller's target wasn't him. He said sensibly, Eric, you guys chat. I'll go over there and say hello to an old friend. Watching Jeffrey walk away, Barry Diller didn't get straight to the point. Instead, he asked softly with a knowing look, Eric, you bought the copyright of Golden Jade League, right? Knowing that he couldn't hide it from a smart person like Barry Diller, Eric nodded with a smile. I didn't care when I saw the document selling the copyright of Golden Jade League. Then, I thought of it after reading the script of Sleepless in Seattle. After saying this, Barry Diller put on a dissatisfied look. Eric, this is completely unnecessary. Isn't our cooperation very pleasant? If you had proposed it personally, maybe Fox could have sold the copyright to you for $1 million. Even I think the price of $3.5 million is too high. Eric was speechless and laughed dryly. After the release of Sleepless in Seattle drove the sales of millions of videotapes of Golden Jade League, well, he couldn't even imagine what kind of expression Barry Diller would have at that time. However, the manager who decided to sell the copyright of Golden Jade League would definitely end up very miserable. Of course, Barry Diller couldn't see through Eric's current thoughts. He took Eric's expression as embarrassment. Instead, he patted Eric's shoulder as if he was comforting him. Forget it. This matter is over. Remember, if you need help next time, you must ask me yourself, okay? Of course I will. Eric nodded sincerely and pretended to raise his glass and clinked it with Barry Diller's gratefully. At the same time, Eric made a decision in his heart. He must remind the little girl to try to get all the adaptation copyrights related to Fox in the copyright list before the end of the year. Probably after this year, he wouldn't be able to get anything from Fox. You're tuning in to the Earbook Haven YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.